Hey there, and welcome back. If you are lying back now, letting the day settle and the room grow quiet around you, then you have come to exactly the right place, because tonight we are going a very long way back, into an England of cold stone castles and candlelit halls, in the years when the crown of this country was a thing men killed and died for. Tonight belongs to a woman who was born at the very heart of that struggle, the eldest daughter of the greatest house in the land, and who found herself, through no choice of her own, bound by marriage to the men on the other side of the quarrel. Her name was Anne, and she was a daughter of York. She was the sister of two kings of England, and the wife, first, of one of their deadliest enemies. Before this evening is over, we will stand with her on the morning after the battle that killed her own father and one of her brothers, a battle that her husband had helped to win, fighting for the side that struck them down. We will follow her through a marriage that the wars tore apart, through ruin and estrangement, and one quiet act of courage that helped to put her brother back upon his throne, and at the last to a love she chose for herself, and to a small chapel at Windsor where two priests were to sing for her soul forever. But all of that lies ahead of us, and the night is long, and we have time to walk the whole of it together. Before we step back across the centuries into her world, let me say one quiet thing, and then I will not break the spell again. If these slow journeys into the far past are the kind of company you would like to find your way to again on another sleepless night, you are always welcome to follow along, and to come back whenever rest is hard to come by. It costs nothing, and it helps these old stories go on being told in the dark. And if you have a moment before you drift, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you lie. For I do love looking through the notes that people leave, and imagining all of you out there, scattered across so many countries and so many deeps of the night, all of us gathered for a little while around the same old tale. That is the whole of it. Now let yourself sink back into the pillow, and we will begin. Picture this. It is high summer in 1439, and we are in the green and watered country of the English Midlands, where the river Nene winds slow through water meadows, and the castle of Fotheringhay stands up grey and strong above the bend of it. This is no rude border keep, but a stately fortress and a family home, the favourite seat of the mightiest noble house in all of England, its towers and curtain walls enclosing courtyards and gardens, and a great hall hung with arms, and within its walls, on a warm August day, a child is being born. She is the first surviving daughter of the Lord of the Castle, and the Lord of the Castle is the most powerful subject in the kingdom, a man with royal blood in his veins, and though no one yet quite says it aloud, a better claim to the throne of England than the gentle king who wears the crown. The child is given the name Anne, and from the very hour of her birth, she is one of the prizes of the realm, a marriageable daughter of the House of York, a small piece on a board where the stakes would, before her life was done, be measured in crowns and in blood. Let us stay a moment in that place, for Fotheringhay was the cradle of the House of York, and it is worth seeing clearly. It was no grim, comfortless fastness, but one of the finest of the family's many seats. A fortified castle set in the gentle Northamptonshire countryside, with a high round keep raised upon its ancient mound, and ranges of fine apartments built out below. All of it ringed with stone walls and a moat fed from the slow waters of the Nene. The badge of the family was carved and painted everywhere about it, the falcon and the fetterlock, the bird of prey within the locked shackle, a device that spoke of restrained power waiting to be loosed, and which would prove, in the years to come, an apt enough emblem for the ambitions of the men who lived beneath it. There were gardens within the walls, and orchards, and a deer park beyond for the hunting, and a college of priests nearby to sing for the souls of the family. And within the great hall, the long tables and the high dais, and the smoke of the fires and the bustle of a household numbering in the scores and at times the hundreds. It was here, In this place of strength and comfort and quiet midland greenery that Anne first opened her eyes upon the world, and it was here that her youngest brother Richard, the last and most faithful of all the children of York, would be born 13 years later. The castle is gone now, pulled down and carted away in the centuries since, with only the green mound and a few stones left to mark where so much history began. But in the summer of Anne's birth it stood whole and proud, the strong heart of a great inheritance, and the baby carried through its chambers was the first child of its lord. To understand the woman she would become, we have to understand the age she was born into, for she was a child of one of the most dangerous and dramatic ages in all of English history, the long civil struggle that later men would name, with a poet's softness, the Wars of the Roses. We are at the very edge of that struggle in the summer of her birth. It has not yet broken into open war. The old king, Henry VI, still sits upon his throne, a gentle and pious and unworldly man, more suited to a monastery than a battlefield, whose weakness would in time pull the whole kingdom down into chaos around him. But beneath the surface of the realm, the bitter rivalries were already stirring. The resentments and ambitions of the mighty families who stood close to the throne, and chief among them stood the house into which our Anne was born, the family of York. Her family was, by blood, very nearly royal, and as the years passed and the king proved more and more unfit to rule, the question of who truly ought to hold the crown of England would come, slowly and terribly, to the centre of everything. Anne was born into the eye of that coming storm, the daughter of the man who stood nearest to it. We should be careful, before we go further, not to imagine these wars as the later legend painted them. Two neat armies under two coloured roses, meeting in tidy battle for a generation. The truth was both messier and stranger than that. The name we give the struggle, the Wars of the Roses, came long after, from the badges that the rival houses are said to have worn. The white rose of York and the red rose of Lancaster, though in truth the roses were only two among a whole forest of badges. And many a man who fought and died in those years never wore a rose at all, but the bear or the bull or the boar or the sun in splendour of some great lord whose livery he had taken. For this was a war waged not by a nation, but by the private armies of the great, by the affinities, as men called them, the networks of retainers and tenants and lesser gentry who wore a lord's badge and ate at his expense and followed him to the field when he called. A duke or an earl could put thousands of such men into harness, and it was with these private hosts, raised from their own broad lands, that the great families made their wars. And the quarrel itself was, at bottom, a family quarrel, a falling out among cousins, for very nearly all the chief actors in it were kin to one another, and kin to the king, descendants in their various lines of the same royal stock, fighting over which branch of one overgrown family tree had the better right to the throne. It was a war of cousins, waged by private armies over a crown, and into the very heart of it Anne of York had been born, and the root of the quarrel ran very deep, deeper than the lifetimes of the men who fought it, all the way back to an usurpation 3 generations before. Long before Anne was born, there had been a king named Richard, the second of that name, who was deposed and done quietly to death by his own cousin, who took the crown for himself and reigned as the first Lancastrian king. That cousin was the grandfather of the gentle Henry VI, and so the whole house of Lancaster sat upon a throne that had been seized rather than inherited, taken from an anointed king by force. For most of a century this had not greatly mattered, for the Lancastrian kings had reigned strongly, and the question had slept. But the blood of the man they had displaced had not died out. It ran on through a daughter and her descendants, and it came down, in the fullness of time, to Anne's own father, Richard of York, who could trace his descent from an elder line of the old royal family than the line of the kings who actually wore the crown. This was the deep ground of York's claim, the buried memory of that ancient usurpation. The argument that the House of Lancaster were not the rightful kings at all, but the heirs of an usurper, and that the true blood royal, the senior branch, ran in the veins of York. So long as the Lancastrian kings ruled well, the argument could stay buried. But when the throne was filled by a man as weak as Henry VI, and when that weak king's government drove the mighty Duke of York into opposition, the old buried claim came creeping back into the light, and men began to ask, dangerously, whether the wrong family had been on the throne all along. That question, 100 years in the making, was the true engine of the wars, and Anne was born its eldest daughter. So let us look, first, at her father, for he is the towering figure over the whole of her early life. Richard, Duke of York, was the greatest nobleman in England, and more than that, he was a prince of the blood, descended from the old King Edward III by not one line but two. Through his father he came down from one of that monarch's sons, and through his mother from another, and that double descent gave him, in the cold arithmetic of inheritance, a claim to the throne that was arguably stronger than the king's own. He was immensely rich, the lord of vast estates across England, Wales, and Ireland, a soldier and a governor who had held high command in the long French wars and ruled as the realm's lieutenant in Normandy and in Ireland. He was, in the ordinary run of things, the natural first servant of the crown, the man the king ought to have leaned upon above all others. But Henry VI did not lean upon him. The king's favour went elsewhere, to a circle of court favourites who feared and resented York's greatness, and over the years that resentment hardened into a feud that would in the end set the entire kingdom alight. Richard of York was proud, able, and conscious to his bones of his own royal blood, and he came slowly to believe that the realm was being misgoverned by lesser men who had stolen the king's ear, and that it was his right and his duty to set it straight. That conviction would carry him, step by step, from loyal subject to rebel to claimant for the crown itself, and it would carry his children with him into a war that would consume half of them. It is worth understanding how this proud man came to his discontent, for he did not begin as a rebel. For most of his life Richard of York served the crown loyally and at heavy cost to himself, and his bitterness was the slow fruit of being passed over and ill-used. He had spent years in France, holding the royal command in Normandy in the long twilight of the English wars there, pouring his own fortune into the defence of conquests that the government at home would not properly pay to keep, and watching, helpless, as the vast inheritance his countrymen had bled for slipped away piece by piece through the weakness and mismanagement of the court. He had been sent, in effect, into honourable exile to govern Ireland, a way of keeping a dangerous mighty man at arm's length from the king. And all the while he saw the king's ear and his favour, and the crown's money flowing to other men, to a rival house above, all the Beauforts, the Dukes of Somerset, who were his enemies at court and who blamed him, as he blamed them, for the disasters in France. The feud between York and Somerset was the seed from which the whole war grew, two mighty men contending for the place nearest the throne of a king too feeble to muster either of them. York believed, with the certainty of a proud man who knows his own worth, that he was being kept from his rightful place by lesser and corrupt men, and that the kingdom suffered for it, and he was, in much of this, simply right. It was the king's tragedy, and England's, that the realm's ablest and greatest subject was driven, by years of slights and exclusions, from loyal service into opposition, and from opposition, at the last, into a claim upon the crown itself. Her mother was a match for him in pride and in blood. Cecily Neville was the daughter of the powerful northern family of Neville, the youngest of the many children of the Earl of Westmoreland, and through her own mother, she too was descended from a son of Edward III, so that the children she bore to York were doubly royal, carrying the blood of old kings down both sides of their line. She was famed for her beauty in her youth, and known by two names that have come down the centuries to us: the Rose of Raby, after the northern castle where she was born, and with rather more edge to it, proud Cis, for the haughty and unbending dignity that marked her all her long life. She was a woman of formidable will and deep devotion, who would in time see her husband and one son cut down in battle, two more sons crowned as kings of England, and yet another son and a grandson destroyed in the dynasty's own quarrels, and who would outlive very nearly all of them, an old and iron matriarch presiding over the wreckage of her own line. This was the woman who bore and raised our Anne, and whatever steel ran in the daughter, she came by it honestly, for there was steel in good measure on both sides of her cradle. The house that Cecily came from, the Nevilles, was itself one of the mightiest in the land, a vast and proliferating northern family, whose sons and daughters had married into half the great houses of England, so that through her mother Anne was cousin to a web of earls and barons that stretched across the whole kingdom. Chief among these Neville kin was Cecily's nephew, the mighty Earl of Warwick, the man who would come to be called the Kingmaker, and the ties of that Neville blood would run all through the wars, binding and dividing the family in ways that would, in the end, turn cousin against cousin and brother against brother. Cecily herself was a woman built on a grand and unbending scale. She was intensely devout, keeping in her later years an almost conventual rule of prayer and reading, rising before dawn to her devotions and ordering her great household with the discipline of an abbess. She was proud to the point of arrogance, insisting upon every ceremony and dignity due to her rank, and that pride only hardened as the years stripped from her almost everyone she loved. For Cecily Neville would prove to be one of the great survivors of her age, outliving her husband and most of her many children, watching from the strange vantage of extreme old age as her sons rose to be kings and then destroyed one another, until she was left, at the very end, an ancient widow presiding alone over the memory of a family that had conquered a throne and then torn itself apart. She would outlive our Anne by nearly 20 years. The daughter would not have to watch the family's final ruin. The mother watched all of it. The world that Cecily came from, the far north of England, was a country apart in those days, wild and hard and remote from the soft south, a land of high moors and stone castles, and a fierce, proud, warlike nobility who lived always with the danger of the Scottish border close at hand. The northern houses, the Nevilles and the Percys above all, were powers unto themselves, ruling their vast estates almost like petty kings, commanding the loyalty of hardy fighting tenants who would follow them to war at a word. Cecily had been born at the castle of Raby, one of the greatest of the Neville strongholds, a mighty pile of towers rising from the cold northern landscape, and she carried the north in her blood, its pride and its hardness and its long memory for a feud. The rivalry of the Nevilles and the Percys was one of the bitterest in all England, an ancient enmity between two overgrown northern dynasties, and that quarrel would feed straight into the wars. The Nevilles for the most part siding with York and the Percys with Lancaster, the local feud and the national one running together. So the wars that engulfed Anne's family were not only a contest for the crown, but also the boiling over of these older, deeper, regional hatreds, the North's hard rivalries spilling out across the entire kingdom. Anne, Midland, born and bred at Fotheringhay, was nonetheless the granddaughter of that fierce northern world, and its blood and its quarrels were woven through her story from the start. Anne was the eldest of their surviving children, the first of them to live, and so for a few short years she was the only child of that great house, before the nursery filled around her, and fill it would. For Cecily Neville bore her husband a remarkable brood, a dozen children in all, though not all of them lived. We should pause over those siblings, for their names and their fates ran like threads through all of Anne's life, and to know them is to feel the strange and terrible drama of the family she belonged to. After Anne came in time, a boy named Edward, born in the year 1442, a tall and golden and gifted child who would grow into one of the most striking men of his age and would, before he was 20, seize the crown of England by force of arms and reign as King Edward IV. After him came Edmund, the Earl of Rutland, a boy close to Edward in age, who would die young and dreadfully in the wars. There were sisters, Elizabeth and Margaret, who would marry into noble houses at home and abroad, Margaret becoming in time the Duchess of Burgundy and one of the most powerful women in Europe. There was George, the Duke of Clarence, charming and unstable and treacherous, who would betray his own brothers more than once and meet a strange and squalid end. And last of all, born at Fotheringhay in 1452, when Anne was already a married girl of 13, came the youngest brother, a small and serious boy named Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, who would grow up to be the most loyal of Edward's supporters and then, in the final act of the family's long tragedy, would take the crown for himself and reign and die as King Richard III. There is a strange circularity worth marking here. For that youngest brother, the future King Richard III, first saw light in the very same castle of Fotheringhay where Anne herself had come into the world 13 years before, the great family seat that was the cradle of them all. So the eldest child of York and the last of the brothers, the eldest sister and the youngest brother, the woman of our story and the man whose terrible reputation would in time overshadow the whole family. Both first drew breath in the same grey Midland fortress above the river. When Richard was born, Anne was already a married girl, her own childhood at Fotheringhay behind her, and we may imagine her, perhaps among the women of the household, when the news came of the new baby, the last of her mother's long line of sons and daughters. She could not have dreamed what that infant would become. The loyal brother turned king, turned byword for usurpation, the boy whose short and storm-tossed reign would end the dynasty forever on a field at Bosworth. He was simply the new baby, the youngest of the children of York, born where she too had begun. The two of them, the eldest and the youngest, bracketed the whole remarkable brood between them, and shared, across the 13 years that divided them, the same birthplace and the same blood, and the same doomed and dazzling family. To grow up a child of such a house was to grow up inside a vast machine of a household, a moving world of hundreds of people that travelled with the family from castle to castle across their estates. A duke's young ones were not raised by their parents in any sense we would recognise, but by a small army of servants set apart for the purpose, wet nurses and rockers for the infants, then nurses and tutors and masters for the growing children. All of it overseen by the chief officers of the household and governed by careful written ordinances that laid down what the children should eat and wear and learn and how they should be corrected. The correction could be hard, for that was an age that believed firmly in the rod, and the sons and daughters of the mighty were schooled in obedience and in the iron forms of courtesy from their earliest years. They learned their place in a world built wholly upon rank and degree, where every person stood somewhere in a great ladder of precedence, and where the sons and daughters of York stood very near the top of it, above almost everyone they would ever meet. They were taught to carry themselves accordingly, to command and to be served, to understand without ever being told that they were of the blood royal and that great things were expected of them. It was a childhood of comfort and privilege, beyond the imagining of ordinary folk, and at the same time a childhood of discipline and expectation and very little tenderness. The raising not so much of children as of pieces destined for the great game of dynasty and power. Fotheringhay was the cradle, but it was far from the only home of the dynasty of York, for a noble family of that age held many houses and moved constantly among them. And Anne's childhood would have been spent travelling between a whole circuit of castles and manors, scattered across the family's vast estates. There was the mighty fortress of Ludlow, away on the Welsh marches, a formidable stronghold from which the family ruled its western lands, and where her brothers Edward and Edmund spent much of their boyhood, and which would give its name, in the route nearby, to one of the darkest moments of the family's fortunes. There was Baynard's Castle in London, the family's townhouse on the bank of the River Thames, a fortified mansion in the heart of the capital, from which the line of York conducted its business in the city and the court, and which would witness, in time, more than one turning point in the family's rise to the throne. And there were manors and castles besides, the scattered seats of a broad inheritance, each with its household and its lands, among which the family circulated with the seasons and the demands of business and the turning of the political year. To be a child of such a house was to know no single fixed home, but rather a whole moving world of fortified seats, a life spent on the road between them, the long trains of carts and horses and servants winding through the English countryside from one stronghold to the next. Anne grew up in this travelling greatness, at home everywhere and nowhere, a daughter of a family whose roots ran wide across the whole of England. Hold that nursery in your mind for a moment, for it is an extraordinary thing to consider. In that one family, in that one set of young ones growing up together in the fine chambers of Fotheringhay, were two future kings of England, a Duchess of Burgundy, and a cast of brothers and sisters, whose loves and betrayals and violent deaths would fill the chronicles of a whole tormented age. And the eldest of them all, the firstborn who watched the others arrive, was Anne. She was the senior of that remarkable generation, the big sister of the children of York, and she would outlive some of them and be outlived by others, and she would be drawn, by the simple fact of her birth and her marriage, into the very heart of the storm that scattered and destroyed so many of them. We know little of her childhood directly, for the chroniclers of that age wrote down the doings of fighting men and spared barely a line for the early years of girls, even the daughters of dukes. But we can build the shape of it. She grew up in wealth and security, and the bright certainty of her own high place, in the nurseries and gardens of her father's castles. Surrounded by servants and tutors, and the constant coming and going of a noble household at the summit of the realm, with the younger of them arriving one by one, and the affairs of the kingdom rumbling always somewhere in the background, in the letters and the visitors, and the grave talk of the grown men. For a girl such as Anne, the shape of that upbringing was bent always toward the single great purpose of her life, which was to be married well, and to be in time the mistress of a noble household of her own. She would have been taught to read, and perhaps a little to write, in the English of her own country, and very likely in some French as well, the polite tongue of the nobility. She would have learned music and dancing, and the fine needlework that filled the hours of high-born women, the embroidery and the working of rich cloth that was both an accomplishment and a quiet act of devotion. She would have been steeped in religion, in the hearing of Mass, and the saying of prayers, and the keeping of the long round of fasts and feasts that ordered the medieval year. And most practically of all, she would have learned by watching her mother the vast and complicated craft of running a household, the management of servants and stores and accounts, the ordering of meals for hundreds, the receiving of guests, the overseeing of estates, the quiet exercise of authority that was the real work of a noblewoman's life. For a great lady was no idle ornament, but the governor of a small kingdom of her own, and the management of it was a serious and demanding profession for which girls like Anne were trained from childhood. All of this Anne would have absorbed in the years before her marriage, the skills and the faith and the iron sense of her own high place, the whole equipment of a medieval noblewoman, laid down in her in the bright, secure season before the wars came to teach her the other, harder lessons of her age. Over all of that world, and over every hour of Anne's days from the cradle, lay the looming presence of the Church, in a way that is hard for a later age to grasp. Religion was not one part of medieval existence among others. It was the air that life was breathed in, the frame around each day and each season and every passage from birth to death, The day itself was measured out by the bells and the hours of prayer, the year by the long unrolling calendar of the church, its feasts and its fasts, its Christmas and its Lent and its Easter, its saints' days falling thick through each month, each with its own observances and its own meaning. A noble household, such as Anne's, kept its own chapel and its own priests, and the family heard Mass daily, and the rhythm of devotion ran through everything. Death was never far off in that world, and the Church gave it meaning and the hope of what lay beyond the heaven, that the good might reach, and the purgatory they must pass through, and the hell that waited for the damned. Pilgrimage drew the faithful to the shrines of the saints, and relics were treasured, and prayers were bought, and chantries were founded, and alms were given. All in the great medieval economy of the soul, the constant traffic between this world and the next. Anne was formed by all of this from her earliest years, steeped in a faith that was woven into the very fabric of her days, and it would carry her through the losses of her life and shape the manner of her death and her remembrance. To understand her, or any person of her age, we have to feel how total and how near that religious world was, how it held all of life in its hands. For all its discipline and its devotion, the life of the great was also one of pleasures, and a noble household such as Anne's filled its leisure with the pastimes proper to its rank, the sports and entertainments that were as much a mark of nobility as the bearing of arms. Chief among them was the hunt, the ruling passion of the medieval aristocracy, the pursuit of the deer through the forests and chases that the nobility guarded jealously for their sport. A hard-riding, exhilarating, faintly martial amusement that was thought to train men for war, and that the women of the noble houses shared in as well. There was the kindred art of hawking, the flying of trained falcons and hawks at birds and small game, a sport of exquisite refinement in which a noblewoman might be as expert as any man, her own hooded falcon riding upon her gloved wrist. For the keeping and flying of hawks was a noble accomplishment, open to both sexes and much beloved. There was music, the playing and singing that filled the long evenings, the minstrels in the hall and the gentler music of the chamber. There was dancing, and there were games of chess and tables and dice, and there was the reading aloud of the romances and tales of chivalry that the nobility loved, the stories of knights and ladies and great deeds that fed their image of themselves. Anne's life, amid all its trials, would have held these pleasures too, the hunt and the hawk and the music and the tales, the bright leisure of the great, woven in among the prayers and the duties and the anxieties of her age. It was not all loss and waiting. There was sport and song and beauty in it as well, the pleasures of a rich and cultivated world at the summit of its kind. But a daughter of York, even the eldest and best beloved, was never wholly her own to keep, for in that world the daughters of the mighty were the coin of high politics, and their marriages were arranged while they were still small children, to bind families together and seal alliances and serve the cold, long purposes of the house. And so it was that Anne, before she was old enough to understand what was being done with her, was promised in marriage. The match her father made for her was a grand one, worthy of the eldest daughter of the greatest house in England. He betrothed her to another young one of royal blood, a boy a few years older than herself, named Henry Holland, the heir to the Dukedom of Exeter, and the wedding, such as it was held when Anne was a very small girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old, in the middle of the 1440s. We must not picture a wedding as we would understand one. This was a child marriage of the medieval kind, a binding contract between two leading families dressed in the forms of a sacrament, the bride a little girl who would have understood almost nothing of the vows spoken over her. The marriage itself a thing of parchment and inheritance that would not become a true marriage in any real sense for many years yet, until the children were grown. But the contract was made, and from that day the small Anne was, in the eyes of the law and the church, the wife of the boy who would be Duke of Exeter, and her fate was tied to his. Such marriages of young ones strike us now as strange and even cruel, and it is worth pausing to understand how the medieval world saw them, for it did not see them as we do. Among the foremost families, marriage had almost nothing to do with the feelings of the two people joined, and everything to do with land, blood, alliance, and inheritance. A daughter was an asset, a means of binding one's house to another, of acquiring estates or settling feuds or climbing the ladder of greatness, and the marrying of her was a matter for hard negotiation between fathers. Conducted while the children were still in the nursery, so that the prize might be secured before a rival could snatch it. The church set the age at which vows could be freely given, and the marriage made complete, but it permitted betrothals and even weddings far younger than that, with the understanding that the union would only become a true marriage in the flesh when the young were grown, and that until then it might, in certain cases, still be undone. So a small girl might be solemnly wedded and live for years as a wife in name while remaining a girl, in fact the marriage, a kind of seed planted early and left to ripen. This was Anne's lot, and it was the lot of very nearly every girl of her rank. She was not consulted, any more than a parcel of land is consulted in its conveyance. She was given, as daughters were given, to serve the purposes of her house, and the only mercy in it was that she was given young enough not yet to understand what was being decided for the whole of her life. It seemed at the time an excellent match, and the king himself approved it. The boy she was given to came of blood almost as grand as her own. The Hollands were an old and mighty family, descended from a half-brother of a long-dead king, kin to the reigning house, and through that descent, young Henry Holland carried in his veins the blood of kings and a place very near the top of the English nobility. When he came into his inheritance, he would be the Duke of Exeter, the premier duke of the realm, after the king's own near kin, the holder of broad estates and a great name. For the daughter of York, it was a brilliant alliance, joining two of the proudest and most exalted of the noble houses. And for York himself, it served a shrewd purpose, drawing a powerful and well-connected young magnate into the orbit of his own family before the boy was old enough to choose his own loyalties. On parchment, in the year of the wedding, it was a triumph of a marriage, and no one looking at the small bride and the boyish groom could have guessed how bitterly it would all turn out, or how the very blood that made the match so grand would, within a few short years, set husband and wife on opposite sides of a war to the death. The grandeur of the Holland blood is worth dwelling on, for it explains both why the match was so brilliant and why it would prove so dangerous. The Hollands had risen, generations before, through one of the great romantic scandals of English dynastic history, when an ancestor of theirs had secretly married a famous beauty known to her own age as the Fair Maid of Kent, a woman of the blood royal who went on, after his death, to marry the heir to the throne and to become the mother of a king. By that marriage, the Hollands were bound by the closest ties of half-blood to the old royal line, and they were lifted to the heights of the nobility, granted the great dukedom of Exeter and vast estates to go with it. They were, in short, very nearly royal themselves, and that nearness to the throne was the making of them, and in the end, very nearly the ruin of them, for it tied them by blood and by sentiment to the reigning house. And when the wars came, it placed them, almost inevitably, on the Lancastrian side. Young Henry Holland's grandfather and great-uncles had been turbulent and ambitious men, plotters and rebels, who had more than once risked and lost everything in the dangerous game of court politics. And there was in the Holland blood a streak of pride and violence and reckless loyalty to a losing cause that ran true generation after generation. In marrying Anne to the heir of Exeter, the Duke of York was joining his house to one of the proudest and most royally connected in the land. He was also, though he could not have known it, joining it to one of the most unstable. It is worth grasping just how small and exalted the circle was at the very top of the English nobility, the circle into which both Anne and her husband were born. Below the king, there were only a handful of dukes in the whole realm, perhaps a dozen or fewer at any one time, the highest rank a subject could hold, reserved very largely for men of royal blood or the very greatest of the nobility. Beneath the dukes came the marquesses and the earls, and beneath them the barons, and beneath the whole peerage the broad ranks of the knights and the gentry, and then the vast mass of the common people, all of it arranged in a strict and visible ladder of degree. To be a duke was to stand among the few score most powerful people in the kingdom, the lords of immense estates, the commanders of private armies, the natural counsellors of the king, the apex of a steeply pointed pyramid of rank. Anne's father was a duke, and the greatest of them. The boy she married was the heir to a dukedom, and would be the premier duke of the realm. Her brothers would be made dukes, and one of them a king. She moved her whole life among this tiny gilded company at the very top of the world, and the gulf between that company and ordinary humanity was almost unimaginably wide. This is part of what makes her later choice, the marrying of a simple knight, so startling, for she stepped down, deliberately, from very near the summit of that ladder, to take the hand of a man who stood many rungs below her. But all that lay ahead. In her youth she was wholly a creature of the heights, a duke's daughter married to a duke's heir, dwelling among the dozen greatest families in England. For there was a flaw in young Henry Holland, and it was a flaw that the years would deepen into something close to ruin. He was, by every account that has come down to us, a man of violent and ungovernable temper, proud, hot-headed, quarrelsome, and quick to the sword. Even in an age of hard and warlike men, the Duke of Exeter stood out as turbulent and dangerous, a man who made enemies easily and bore grudges long, whose pride was a raw and touchy thing, and whose temper could turn in an instant to brutality. There was a streak in him that bent always toward violence and toward trouble, and as he grew to manhood, it would lead him into one quarrel after another, and at last into the most ruinous loyalty of his life. And there was the other thing, the thing that would matter most of all. His blood, which made the match with Anne so grand, tied him by kinship and by sympathy to the family of Lancaster, to the line of the reigning king. When the great quarrel between York and the court at last broke into open war, Henry Holland would not hesitate for a moment over which side he belonged to. He was Lancaster to the marrow, the king's man and the crown's kinsman, and he would throw himself into the Lancastrian cause with all the ferocity of his nature. The girl he had married was the daughter of the House of York. The wars that were coming would set the two of them, husband and wife, on opposite sides of a chasm of blood. And there is no sign that Henry Holland ever once let his marriage soften by a hair's breadth his hatred of his wife's family. The records of his life bear out this dark reputation at every turn, even before the wars gave his violence a battlefield to spend itself upon. Henry Holland was a byword for lawless and overbearing conduct, a mighty lord who used his power as a bludgeon. He fell into a bitter feud with a neighbouring magnate over a question of lands, and pressed his claim not through the courts, but through naked force, gathering armed men and seizing what he wanted and defying the king's own officers who came to restrain him. He held, for a time, high office under the Lancastrian king, including the keeping of the great fortress of the Tower of London, and his name became attached to the grim instruments of that place, so that men spoke of his cruelty with a shudder. He was the kind of man the whole apparatus of medieval law was forever struggling and failing to contain, a violent and entitled aristocrat who believed that his blood set him above the rules that bound lesser men. To be the wife of such a man, even at a distance, even in name, was no light thing. And though Anne was spared the worst of him by the long years before the marriage was consummated, and by the wars that soon set them apart, the records leave us in no doubt about the temper of the man to whom her childhood had bound her. He was proud, He was brutal, and he was, above all, unshakably loyal to the dynasty of Lancaster, and each of those three things would help to wreck the marriage that had looked, on parchment, so fine. But all of that lay in the future, in the summer of the infant marriage, and for a time the arrangement was a peaceable and even a pleasant one. Young Henry Holland did not, as a husband usually would, carry his small bride off to his own household to be raised among strangers. Instead, by an unusual arrangement, the boy came to live with his bride's family, brought up for a time in the household of the Duke of York at Fotheringhay, raised alongside the very sons and daughters he would one day fight. Picture that for a moment, the strangeness of it, the future Duke of Exeter, growing up in the nurseries and tilt-yards of York, a boy among the children of the house. Learning his letters and his arms in the same halls, where the little Edward and Edmund were learning theirs, all of them together under one roof, with no shadow yet upon them of the day when the men those boys became would meet on the field with naked steel. The two of them, Anne and Henry, would have grown up in a kind of proximity, husband and wife in name, playmates and housemates. In fact, the marriage waiting, as such marriages did, for the slow years to make the young into a man and a woman. It would be the better part of a decade before the marriage became a marriage in the full sense, before it was consummated, and Anne began to bear her husband's sons and daughters. By then the world they had been children in was already cracking apart. There is something poignant in trying to picture those early years of the marriage that was not yet a marriage. The two young ones sharing a household, bound by vows that neither of them had chosen, and that one of them had been far too young even to understand. The medieval custom was clear and was generally observed that a marriage made between children should not be consummated until both were judged old enough. And so, for the better part of a decade, Anne and Henry Holland lived as wedded strangers. Growing up side by side, the boy some way ahead of the girl, the two of them moving from childhood toward the age at which they would be expected to become husband and wife in earnest and to begin the getting of heirs. We cannot know what passed between them in those years, whether there was any warmth or friendship, or whether the difference in their ages and the coldness of the arrangement kept them always apart. We know only that when the time came, around the time Anne reached the age of 17, the marriage was at last made complete, and she conceived and bore her husband a child. By then, however, the careful arrangement that had joined them was being overtaken by events far larger than any marriage. The slow quarrel of York and the court was hardening toward war, and the boy and girl who had been wedded to seal an alliance between two noble houses were about to find those very houses turning into mortal enemies. The marriage had been built for a world of peace and alliance. That world was ending. For while Anne grew from a little girl into a young woman in the leading houses of York, the long, slow, grinding quarrel that would tear England in two was building toward its breaking point. We should understand what it was about, for it is the engine that drives all of her story. At the heart of it sat the weakness of the king. Henry VI was a good man and a bad king, gentle, pious, generous, and utterly unfit for the brutal business of ruling a fractious medieval kingdom. He could not master his quarrelsome nobles, could not manage his own finances, could not hold the conquests his great father had won in France, which slipped away little by little to England's bitter shame. Worse, he fell, more than once, into a strange and total collapse of mind, a kind of stupor in which he knew no one and could neither speak nor act, leaving the kingdom for long months with a crowned king who was no king at all. Around this broken man the great nobles circled and contended, and the realm divided slowly into two grand parties. On the one side stood the court, dominated by the royal favourites, and above all by his fierce and able French queen, Margaret of Anjou, a woman of iron will, who fought like a lioness for the rights of her husband and her young son. On the other side, drawn there as much by the hostility of the court as by his own ambition, stood Anne's father, Richard of York, the king's mightiest subject, and by blood, his most dangerous rival. The backdrop against which the family quarrel hardened into war was a kingdom sliding into crisis on every front, and the years of Anne's childhood and youth were years of mounting national disaster. The long war in France, which her grandfather's generation had so triumphantly won, was being lost, province by province, until the great English empire across the Channel had shrunk almost to nothing. A humiliation that the entire country felt as a bitter shame, and for which men looked about angrily for someone to blame. The royal government was sunk in debt, unable to pay its soldiers or its servants, its finances a shambles. Justice was failing, the powerful lords increasingly taking the law into their own hands. Private feuds settled by armed force, while the crown looked on helpless. And the common people, taxed and misruled and ashamed, rose at last in a rebellion. A vast rising of the men of the southern counties, who marched on London, demanding the removal of the crown's corrupt favourites and the reform of his government. That rising was put down, but it left the realm shaken, and the king's authority diminished, and it showed how deep the discontent ran. Into this failing kingdom, with its lost wars and empty treasury and broken justice and seething people, the rivalry of York and the court injected its own poison, and the two crises fed one another, the weakness of the government making the great men bolder, the rivalry of the powerful men making the government weaker still. It was a realm ripe for civil war, and civil war, in time, it got. It is worth looking more closely at the two who stood at the centre of the other party, the monarch and his queen, for they shaped Anne's age as surely as her own father did. King Henry VI was, by all accounts, a genuinely good and gentle soul, devout almost to the point of saintliness, generous, merciful, and entirely without the hardness that the rule of a medieval kingdom demanded. He founded great colleges and loved learning and prayer, and he shrank from bloodshed and cruelty in a way that would have made him a fine monk and made him a disastrous king. He had come to the throne as a baby, the son of a famous warrior father whose conquests he could never hope to match, and he grew into a man wholly unable to control the violent and ambitious lords who surrounded him, swayed this way and that by whoever last had his ear. And then, in the prime of his life, he fell into a complete collapse of his wits. A long stupor in which he sat speechless and senseless and knew no one, not even his own newborn son, when the child was brought and held before him. The kingdom was left rudderless, with a king who was a monarch in name only, and into that vacuum the mighty lords poured their rivalries. Where the gentle king failed, his queen did not. Margaret of Anjou was everything her husband was not: fierce, proud, tireless, and utterly determined, a French princess who came to see the line of York as the deadly enemy of her husband's crown and her son's inheritance, and who would fight for that inheritance with a ferocity that earned her the hatred of her enemies and the awe of history. It was she, far more than the broken king, who became the soul of the Lancastrian cause, and it was against her, in the end, that the whole strength of York was bent. We should be careful, amid all this talk of battles and dynasties, not to imagine that the whole of England was a smoking ruin throughout these years, for the truth is more curious than that. The Wars of the Roses, for all their drama and their slaughter, were fought in short, sharp bursts, a battle here and a campaign there, separated by long stretches of uneasy peace. And the fighting touched only a small part of the country at any one time. For most ordinary English men and women, life went on through these years, much as it always had. The fields ploughed and sown and reaped, the markets held, the children born and the dead buried, the seasonal round of the farming year turning as it had turned for centuries. A peasant in a quiet shire might live his whole life through the wars and never see an army or hear a battle, knowing of these events only as distant rumour. A change in the name of the sovereign proclaimed in the market square. The wars were, in the main, a quarrel of the mighty, fought by the powerful and their retainers, and the common people were more often spectators than victims, save for those unlucky enough to live where the armies marched or to be levied into them. This is worth remembering, for it sets Anne's world in its true proportion. The agonies of her family, the deaths and the ruin and the turnings of fortune were the agonies of a tiny ruling class, played out above the head of a country that mostly went on with its ordinary business. The wheel of fortune turned giddily for the few. For the many, the ox still had to be driven and the harvest still had to be got in, and those ordinary people, like the powerful above them, lived always in the shadow of sickness, for this was an age with almost no defence against disease, in which death by illness was a constant and familiar presence at every level of society. The medicine of the day, for all the learning of its physicians, could do very little against the real killers, understanding nothing of how disease spread and possessing no remedy that truly worked against the worst epidemics. Above all, there was the plague, the terrible pestilence that had swept through Europe 100 years before Anne's birth and carried off a third or more of all the people of England in a single horror. And that returned, again and again, in lesser but still dreadful visitations, all through the century that followed. No one was safe from it, not the peasant in his hovel, nor the duke in his castle, for the plague struck down the mighty and the humble alike, and a family might lose half its sons and daughters to a single bad season of it. Children especially died in vast numbers of the plague and of the many other fevers and fluxes that medicine could not touch, so that even in the wealthiest households the raising of a young one to adulthood was a thing that could never be taken for granted. Anne's own mother bore a dozen children, and saw several of them die young, which was the common lot of mothers in that age. And it is a measure of the precariousness of life that even the daughter of the greatest house in England grew up amid the constant nearness of death by sickness. The wars were dramatic and terrible, but they killed far fewer, in the end, than the quiet, ceaseless work of disease, which was the true and constant reaper of that whole world. And all of existence, the labour of the many and the leisure of the few alike, turned upon the eternal round of the year, the unchanging cycle of the seasons that ordered the medieval age far more deeply than the comings and goings of kings. It began its work in the spring, with the ploughing and the sowing and the lambing, the land waking from the dead of winter. The summer brought the long days of growth and the hard labour of the harvest, the gathering of the corn that the whole survival of the kingdom depended on, the most anxious and important season of all. For a failed harvest meant hunger, and a good one meant life. The autumn brought the slaughter of the beasts that could not be kept through the winter, the salting of meat, the gathering in of the last of the year's bounty. And the winter brought the long, dark cold, the time of indoor work and of waiting, lit by the feast of Christmas, with its 12 days of revelry that brightened the deepest dark of the year. Through it all ran the church's own calendar of feasts and fasts, woven into the farming calendar, so that the seasons of the soil and the seasons of the soul turned together, all of life keeping time to a rhythm that had turned the same way for centuries and would turn so for centuries more. Anne's life, for all its drama of wars and crowns, was lived within this turning round of the seasons, its festivals and its labours and its long dark winters, the deep slow rhythm beneath the noise of history, the same rhythm that turns, in its quieter way, beneath our own lives still. For years the quarrel simmered without quite boiling over, a matter of bitter words and armed standoffs and uneasy truces, with York pressing to be heard and the court working always to shut him out. But in the early summer of the year 1455, the long enmity drew its first blood. York and his great Neville allies, finding themselves once more excluded and in danger, took up arms and marched on the monarch, and they met the royal forces in the streets of the little town of St. Albans, north of London. The fighting there was short and sharp, more a brawl among the houses than a great battle, but it ended in victory for York, and when the smoke cleared, the chief of the royal favourites lay dead in the gutters, and the gentle king himself, wounded in the neck by an arrow, was a prisoner in York's hands. It was the first battle of the long wars, and though no one then could have known how many would follow, a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. Blood had been spilled between the noble houses, and men had died. And the dead leave heirs who do not forget. Among those heirs was a young lord whose father had been slain that day at St. Albans, and who would nurse the memory of it like a coal held in the hand, waiting for the chance to repay it. The wars had a way of breeding such debts, fathers cut down, and sons grown up to avenge them, and that grim arithmetic of vengeance would run all through the years that followed. It is worth pausing on what one of these battles actually was, for the word conjures, to a modern mind, something far more orderly than the reality. A medieval battle was something of appalling intimacy and terror, fought hand to hand with edged steel by men packed close together in the press. The mighty lords and knights went into it, encased in plate armour, sheathed head to foot in shaped and polished steel that could turn a sword cut and even often an arrow, so that the well-armoured man was fearsomely hard to kill, and the battles among the nobility were as much exhausting wrestling matches as butchery. Men hammering at one another with poleaxe and mace until someone was beaten to the ground and could be finished through the gaps in his harness or held for ransom. But the common men who made up the bulk of the hosts had no such protection, only a padded jacket perhaps, and a steel cap. And it was they who died in their thousands, ridden down in the rout, shot full of arrows, hacked apart in the crush. The armies were raised from the land at need, the retainers and tenants of the powerful lords, ordinary men pulled from their fields and villages and set in array under the badge of whichever magnate held their loyalty, and then flung against other such men from other such villages. And looming over the whole grim business was the longbow, that terrible English weapon, which, in the hands of massed archers, could darken the sky with arrows and break a charge or an advancing line before it ever closed. To stand in the front rank as the arrows came was to face a storm of iron, and many a battle was half decided before the hand-to-hand fighting even began. This was the kind of violence into which the quarrel of York and Lancaster had now loosed the kingdom, and it would be visited again and again over the coming years. Upon the fields of England, there was an uneasy peace after St. Albans, a few years of patched-up quiet, but the wound did not heal, and in the autumn of the year 1459 it broke open again. And this time it nearly destroyed the family of York altogether. The two sides gathered their armies, and at a place called Ludford Bridge, near the Welsh border, the forces of York found themselves outnumbered, and worse, betrayed, as a body of their own troops slipped away in the night to the monarch. York saw that his cause was lost for the moment, and rather than fight a hopeless battle, he fled. The whole leadership of the family of York scattered into exile in a single night, the Duke himself running for Ireland, and his eldest son Edward, the tall golden boy, now grown to a formidable young man of 17, escaping across the sea to the fortress of Calais with the Nevilles. They left behind them their lands, their goods, and the women of the family, and the victorious court party fell upon all of it. A parliament was summoned, and York and his chief allies were declared traitors, their lives forfeit and their estates seized, their very blood corrupted in law, so that their heirs could inherit nothing. For a few dark months it seemed that the Yorkist cause was finished, its lord a fugitive in Ireland. its heir an exile across the water, its lands in the hands of its enemies. Anne, a young married woman by now, lived through that overturning, the sudden plunge of her father's house from the summit of the realm to outlawry and ruin. And she would have learned in those months the lesson that the whole of her life kept teaching her, that fortune in that age was a wheel that turned without warning, and that those who rode highest had the furthest to fall, and it fell hardest, often, upon the women who could not fight and could not flee so easily, and who were left to face the victors when the men had run. When the House of York collapsed at Ludford, and its lords scattered into exile, it was the Duchess Cecily, Anne's mother, who was left behind to meet the conquerors. Standing with her youngest children at the market cross of the town, it was said, while the victorious soldiers plundered all about her. The women of a defeated house were not usually killed, for that was not the custom of these wars, at least not in their earlier and more chivalrous years, but they could be stripped of everything, their homes plundered, their goods seized, their incomes cut off, and themselves placed under guard or under the grudging charge of some relative on the winning side. They lived through the overturnings of fortune with a particular kind of helplessness, unable to strike a blow in their own defence, forced to watch and to endure and to wait for the wheel to turn again. Some took refuge in the one place. The violence of that age was bound, at least in theory, to respect the sanctuary of the church, the great abbeys and cathedrals, where a fugitive might claim the protection of God and be, for a time, beyond the reach of his enemies. The right of sanctuary was an ancient and powerful thing, and it would shelter more than one member of Anne's family in the years to come. The desperate and the defeated creeping into holy ground to wait out the storm. For the women especially, in a world where they could neither command armies nor wield swords, endurance was the only weapon, and the waiting out of disaster the only victory available to them. It was a lesson Anne learned early and would practice all her life. And word of these great upheavals travelled slowly. In a world without any of the swift means of sending news that later ages would know, word moved at the pace of a horse or a ship or a walking man, carried by messengers and merchants and travellers along the rough roads of the kingdom, so that the news of a battle might take days to reach the far corners of the land, and might arrive garbled or false or already overtaken by the next turn of events. For a woman like Anne, waiting at one of her estates or at the court while the men were away at the wars, this slowness must have been its own particular torment, the long days of not knowing, of waiting for a rider to bring word of whether a father or a brother lived or died, of catching at rumours that might be true or might be cruel inventions. The roads themselves were poor, often little more than muddy tracks. Hard going in winter, plagued by robbers in the wilder stretches, and a journey of 100 miles was the work of many days. The kingdom was by our measure a vast and slow and dimly connected place, where a great event in the north might be old history before it was fully understood in the south, and where the powerful spent much of their lives on the move, travelling endlessly between their scattered estates and to and from the court and the wars. Anne's life, like all lives of her age, was lived at this walking and riding pace. In a world where distance was real and news was slow, and the waiting for word was one of the great trials of those who stayed behind. It is from this very world of waiting and of letters that we catch some of our rare glimpses into the inner lives of the women of that age. For here and there the letters of a family have survived the centuries, and in them we hear, faint but clear, the actual voices of medieval wives going about the business of their lives. In a few precious cases, the correspondence of a gentry family has come down to us, the letters they wrote to one another across the distances of the kingdom, and through them we can listen in on the wives and mothers managing estates while their husbands were away, defending houses against armed neighbours, arranging marriages for their children, worrying over money and lawsuits and the dangers of the times, scolding and advising and loving across the miles. These voices are not Anne's, for no such intimate letters of hers survive, but they belong to women of her age, and they remind us that behind the bare official records there were real people with true feelings. Women of force and shrewdness and tenderness, running their corners of a hard world. When we try to imagine Anne, we can borrow something from these surviving voices, and picture her too, as such a woman, capable and watchful, managing her great estates, keeping her household, enduring the anxieties of an age of war, a real person living a true life behind the few dry facts that the chroniclers troubled to set down. The letters are a window, narrow but clear, into the lost daily world of the medieval woman, and through it we can see, dimly, the kind of life that Anne herself must have lived. The very tongue in which such letters were written tells its own quiet story of a changing world. For Anne lived in the age when the English language was at last coming fully into its own. For many generations after the conquest of England by French-speaking lords, the nobility of the kingdom had spoken French, and the business of law and government had been conducted in French and in Latin, while English was left to the common people, a despised and unofficial tongue. But across the years before and during Anne's life, that dominance of French was fading, and English was rising to become once more the language of all ranks, the tongue in which the great now spoke and increasingly wrote, in which letters were sent, and wills were made, and before long, books were printed. It was the English of that age, rich and supple, and not so very far from our own, that Anne would have spoken and thought in, the language of her household and her family and her prayers. And learning itself was slowly spreading. Beyond the clergy who had so long monopolized it, among the gentry and the nobility and the rising merchants, more of whom could now read and write and valued the doing of it. Anne's own brother, the king, was a lover of fine books, a collector of beautiful manuscripts, and the patron, in his last years, of the new craft that would carry reading to multitudes. Anne lived, though she can scarcely have known it, at one of the turning points of her country's life. The age when its language found its full voice, and the written word began its slow journey from the few to the many. The world she knew was medieval to its bones. But in this one respect it stood already at the threshold of the age to come. But the family of York was not finished. Within a year the exiles came storming back, and the wheel turned again. In the summer of 1460, Edward and the Nevilles landed in England, raised the country behind them, and crushed the royal army at the Battle of Northampton, taking the poor king prisoner once more. And then the Duke himself came home from Ireland, and he did a thing that startled even his own supporters. A thing that pushed the quarrel past the point of any return. Walking into the Parliament chamber at Westminster, Richard of York laid his hand upon the empty throne and claimed the crown of England for his own, by right of his royal blood. It was a step too far and too fast for most men, who balked at simply deposing an anointed king. However feeble, a compromise was patched together, an arrangement men called the Act of Accord, by which the gentle King Henry would be allowed to keep his crown for the rest of his life, but upon his death it would pass, not to his own young son, but to Richard of York and his heirs. At a stroke, Anne's father was named the heir to the throne of England, and her brothers were made princes in waiting, and the small disinherited boy, whose birthright had been signed away, was the son of the most dangerous woman in the kingdom. Queen Margaret of Anjou would sooner have died than see her son robbed of his inheritance, and she was even then gathering a great army in the north, an army of the hard-fighting lords of the northern counties, to undo the whole arrangement by force. And among the captains of that gathering army, riding with the Queen against the dynasty of York, was Anne's own husband, the Duke of Exeter. What came next was the blackest day the Yorkist cause had yet known. and it touched Anne as closely as anything in her whole life, for it cost her a father and a brother, and her husband was on the other side of it. As the year 1460 drew toward its close, her father marched north to face the Queen's gathering host, and he took with him his second son, Anne's brother Edmund, the young Earl of Rutland. A boy of 17, they came to the Duke's own castle of Sandal, near the town of Wakefield in Yorkshire, and there, 2 days after Christmas, the thing went terribly wrong. Whether York was lured out by a trick, or whether he simply misjudged the strength of the enemy and sallied out from the safety of his walls in too much confidence, the chroniclers cannot fully agree, but the end of it is not in doubt. The Yorkist force was caught in the open and overwhelmed, surrounded and cut to pieces in the winter fields below the castle. Richard, Duke of York, the mighty Lord of Fotheringhay, the heir to the throne of England, Anne's father, was killed in the press of the fighting, and her young brother Edmund, fleeing the lost field, was caught upon the bridge at Wakefield and cut down without mercy. Killed, men said, in cold blood by a vengeful lord whose own father had died at St. Albans, the wheel of vengeance turning once more. Father and son, both dead in a single dreadful afternoon, and it was not enough for the victors. They struck the head from the dead Duke's body and carried it to the city of York, and there, in mockery of the man who had claimed a crown, they set it up over the gate with a crown of paper jammed upon its brow, so that, as they jeered, York might overlook the town of York. It was a savagery that shocked even that hard age. The cruelty of Wakefield marked a darkening of the whole struggle, a turning of the wars from a contest among cousins into something closer to a blood feud without limit. In the earlier clashes there had been a certain restraint, a sense that these were quarrels among kinsmen that might yet be patched up, and the common soldiers had borne the brunt, while the leading men were often spared for ransom or reconciliation. But Wakefield, with its killing of a great duke and the cold murder of his teenage son and the obscene mockery of the severed head, broke something. Each side now had its martyrs to avenge, its fathers and brothers and sons cut down, and vengeance bred vengeance in a widening spiral. The young Earl of March, Anne's brother Edward, would not forget who had killed his father and his brother, and when his turn came, he would repay it without mercy. The lords who had triumphed at Wakefield would themselves be hunted down and destroyed in their turn. This was the terrible logic that the wars had now entered, in which every act of slaughter planted the seed of the next, and in which the killing could not stop because too much blood had been shed for anyone to forgive. It was into this spiral, this self-feeding machine of vengeance, that Anne's family was now wholly committed, and it would devour before it was done. Very nearly all of them. The paper crown over the gate at York was not an ending. It was a beginning. The weeks after Wakefield saw the wheel spin faster than at almost any other time in the entire struggle. And it is worth following that spin, for Anne's husband was in the thick of it. Flushed with their victory in the north, the Queen's army came surging southward, a great host with a fearsome reputation, said to be plundering the country as it came, so that the whole south of England trembled at the rumour of its approach. It met a Yorkist force under the Earl of Warwick at St. Albans, the very town where the wars had drawn their first blood 6 years before, and there, in a second battle, fought over the same ground. The Queen's army won a hard victory and freed the captive King Henry, who was found, it was said, sitting quietly beneath a tree, laughing and singing to himself, while the battle raged about him. Among the Lancastrian commanders in that victory was Anne's husband, the Duke of Exeter, fighting once more against her family and winning once more. For a moment the Lancastrian cause stood at its very height. The king freed, 2 battles won, the road to London open, and then it all slipped away, for the great city of London, terrified of the wild northern army and its reputation for plunder, shut its gates against the Queen and would not let her in. That refusal was the turning point of the entire war, for it left the field open to the young Edward of York, who came down from the west and was welcomed into the city the Queen had been denied, and proclaimed himself king within its walls. The wheel, which had carried Lancaster so high in those few weeks, now flung it down and carried Anne's brother to the throne. We must hold steady here and feel the full weight of what this meant for Anne, for it is the cruel pivot of her entire life. Her father was dead, butchered in a winter field. Her brother Edmund was dead, cut down on a bridge as he fled. Her father's head was rotting over a city gate beneath a paper crown. And her husband, the man she had been married to since she was a small child, the Duke of Exeter, had ridden with the army that did it. He was a commander on the winning side at Wakefield, one of the captains of the host that killed her father and her brother and mocked the dead. There is no record of what Anne felt in those weeks, no letter, no reported word, for the chroniclers did not trouble to ask what the women felt while the men killed one another. But we do not need a chronicle to imagine it. She was a daughter of York to the depths of her being, and her family had just been struck a blow of unspeakable cruelty, and the hand that helped to strike it was joined to hers by the vows of the Church. Whatever bond there had ever been between Anne and Henry Holland, whatever a child marriage and a decade of shared roofs had built between them, Wakefield must have broken it past all mending. From that winter, husband and wife were not merely on opposite sides of a political quarrel. They were divided by blood spilled, by a father and a brother in their graves, and there could be no going back from that Anne's plight. Of a woman bound by marriage to the enemies of her own blood was an extreme case, but it was not a unique one, for the wars had a peculiar genius for cutting straight through the middle of families. Because the noble houses were all so intricately intermarried, cousins to one another and cousins to the king. The dividing line of the quarrel did not run neatly between families, but jaggedly through them, setting brother against brother, uncle against nephew, husband against wife's kin. A man might find his own son-in-law arrayed against him on the field, or his brother under the enemy's banner. The ties of blood and the ties of allegiance pulling in opposite directions until one or the other had to tear. The wars were full of such agonies, of loyalties divided and households split, of men who had to choose between the lord they served and the kin they loved. Anne stood at one of the sharpest of these divisions, a daughter of York married to a pillar of Lancaster, and for her the choice was never really in doubt, for her heart was wholly with her own people. But the position itself, the being torn between the two great loyalties of blood and marriage, was one that many in that age would have recognised, and it gives her story a representative weight beyond her own person. She is, in a sense, the wars themselves made flesh in a single woman, the quarrel running directly through her own marriage bed, the white rose and the red contending within the compass of one unhappy union. And the wheel was not done turning, for the death of the father did not end the line of York, but made it more dangerous, for it put at its head a young man of genius for war, Anne's brother Edward. Now in his 19th year, became at his father's death the new Duke of York and the new heir to the throne under the Act of Accord, and he proved at once to be everything his enemies most feared, a brilliant and ruthless soldier, tall and beautiful and utterly without fear, who would avenge his father with a thoroughness that left England stunned. While the Queen's victorious host swept south to its costly triumph at St. Albans, it was the young Duke, welcomed into a London that had barred its gates against the Northern army, who seized the great prize. In the first days of March, in 1461, he was proclaimed king in the capital, taking the throne his father had claimed, and reigning from that day as King Edward IV. Anne's brother was a king. And then, to make the crown secure. He marched north to destroy the Lancastrian army once and for all. There is one strange and beautiful moment from the young Edward's road to the throne that deserves to be remembered, for it shows how the men of that age read the heavens for signs and omens. Shortly before he was proclaimed king, in the cold dawn before a battle he fought in the West Country against a Lancastrian force, Edward and his men looked up to see a marvel in the winter sky, 3 suns shining side by side, blazing in the morning air. It is a thing that does sometimes happen, a trick of ice and light in the high cold air that scatters the image of the sun into 3. But to the soldiers, waiting fearful in the dawn, it seemed a portent, and they took it for an evil one, an omen of doom. It was Edward, by the story, who turned it to courage. He told his frightened men that the 3 suns stood for the Holy Trinity, that God was with them and had sent the sign as a blessing. And he bade them take heart and fight they did, and won. And from that morning, Edward took for his own personal badge the device of the sun in splendour, the blazing sun with its streaming rays, and wore it ever after as the emblem of his house and his victories. It is a small thing, that frozen marvel in the winter sky, but it lingers in the mind, the young golden warrior turning an omen of fear into one of hope on the morning of a battle. And it tells us much about the age Anne lived in, an age that watched the heavens for the will of God and found meaning and terror and courage written in the lights of the sky. The 2 armies came together on a high windswept plateau between the villages of Towton and Saxton in Yorkshire on Palm Sunday, the 29th of March in 1461, in the teeth of a driving snowstorm. It was, by every account that survives, the largest and most terrible battle ever fought on English soil, a thing of nightmare. Tens of thousands of men on each side hacking at one another through a whole long day of blizzard and slaughter. The snow blew into the faces of the Lancastrians and blinded them, and the Yorkist archers used the wind to shoot further than the enemy could shoot back, and by the end of that dreadful day, the Lancastrian host was broken and fled, and the pursuit turned into a massacre. Men drowned in the swollen rivers trying to escape, and the snow, it was said, lay red for miles. The dead were counted by chroniclers who surely exaggerated, but who were reaching for something true, in the tens of thousands. It was a catastrophe for the family of Lancaster, the ruin of its army and the breaking of its power, and it set the crown firmly upon the head of Anne's brother Edward. And once again, among the captains of the losing side, fighting for Lancaster against the brother of his own wife, was Henry Holland, the Duke of Exeter. He survived the slaughter and fled the lost field, and escaped northward into the wild country and across the border into Scotland, in the bedraggled train of the defeated king and queen. A beaten man running for his life from the triumph of his wife's family. The scale of the slaughter at Towton is hard to take in, and the chroniclers themselves seem to grope for words equal to it. Tens of thousands of Englishmen are said to have fallen there in a single day, more than in any other battle ever fought upon the soil of this island. The flower of the Lancastrian nobility cut down or drowned or hunted to death in the snow. For a long generation afterward, the memory of that Palm Sunday hung over the country like a shadow, the day the kingdom had torn itself apart in the blizzard. And the man whose victory it was, Anne's brother Edward, stepped out of that carnage transformed. No longer merely a claimant, but a king crowned in blood and proven in the most terrible school there was. He was, by all accounts, a magnificent figure, well over 6 feet tall in an age of smaller men. Golden-haired and handsome and easy and charming, a born soldier who had never yet lost a battle, and a born prince who looked the part as few men ever have. He could be merciless, as Towton showed, and he could be lazy and pleasure-loving in the years of peace that his victories brought, sinking into feasting and women and ease. but in the field he was deadly, swift and bold and lucky. And the throne he had seized at the point of the sword he would hold, with one brief interruption, for the rest of his life. This was the brother to whom Anne's fortunes were now joined, the golden warrior king, and his rise had lifted her, the eldest of all his sisters, to a height she could never have reached by her marriage, even as that same marriage had become a ruin and a reproach. When Anne's brother came in time to be crowned, the ceremony that made him king was the most sacred and solemn in the life of the realm, a piece of holy theatre that transformed a man into something more than a man. The coronation took place at the Abbey of Westminster, amid a magnificence of procession and pageantry, but its heart was a moment of deep religious mystery, the anointing of the new king with holy oil. For it was believed that this anointing changed the king's very nature, set him apart from all other men, made him a sacred person, the Lord's anointed, ruling by the grace of God himself. The crown was placed upon his head, the orb and sceptre put into his hands, the sword of state girded upon him, each with its solemn meaning, and the assembled lords did him homage, and the people acclaimed him. And a man who had been merely the greatest of subjects rose from that altar a king, hedged about with a holiness that made rebellion against him a kind of sacrilege. This was the prize for which the whole bloody struggle was fought, this sacred kingship, and it is part of what made the wars so terrible, that men were contending not merely for power, but for a throne wrapped in the awe of religion, a crown that God himself was held to bestow. Anne's brother had seized that crown by the sword, but the anointing made it sacred upon his head, and her family, in winning it, had won the holiest thing the kingdom had to give. She had been born the daughter of a man who reached for that sacred crown and died reaching. She lived to see her brother wear it, anointed and holy, the King of England, by the grace of God. So the wheel had come full round. The family of York, which a few months before had seen its lord butchered and his head crowned with paper, now held the throne of England, and the young King Edward IV reigned in splendour, and Anne, the eldest of all his sisters, was no longer merely the daughter of a duke, but the sister of a king, a princess of the new royal house. It should have been the summit of her fortunes, and in many ways it was. But her marriage hung about her neck like a stone, for her husband was a traitor and a fugitive, and a tainted enemy of her brother the monarch. And the war that had raised her family to the throne had cast hers down into ruin. There was no way now for Anne and Henry Holland to live as husband and wife. He was a hunted Lancastrian in exile beyond the sea, his name a byword for treason at her brother's court, and she was the crown's sister, the first lady of the realm after the Queen. The marriage that had once been the brilliant joining of two royal houses had become an impossible thing, a chain binding a princess of the winning side to a beggared traitor of the losing one. And it was about to grow stranger still. To be the sister of the monarch of England was to stand among the very first people in the realm, and whatever the wreck of her marriage, Anne's place at her brother's court was one of great honour and great wealth. Edward's court, once the wars had given him a few years of peace to enjoy it, became one of the most splendid in Europe, a place of feasts and pageantry and rich display, where the new king spent freely on fine clothes and jewels and building and all the magnificence that proclaimed the glory of his house. The royal sisters and the royal kin moved through this world as its brightest ornaments, given precedence above all others, granted lands and incomes to support their dignity, married where marriages could still be made, to the greatest matches at home and abroad. Anne's younger sister Margaret would be wedded, in a ceremony of dazzling splendour, to the Duke of Burgundy, the ruler of the richest lands in Europe, and would become a great princess of the continent. Anne herself, though tied to a ruined and exiled husband, held her own high place, established in her brother's favour, mistress of the Exeter estates that the sovereign had given her. A duchess and a king's sister, with all the wealth and standing that those titles carried. The girl who had been born the daughter of a duke had become, through the violent turning of the wheel, the sister of a king, lifted by the same wars that had cast her husband down. It was a strange elevation, bought at the price of a father's life and a marriage's ruin. But it was real, and Anne lived the rest of her days as one of the great ladies of the land. The outward magnificence of a noblewoman's life in that age was a thing carefully calculated to proclaim her station, for in a world built on visible degree, what one wore and owned and displayed was a kind of language, announcing to all who saw it exactly where one stood in the great order of things. A woman of Anne's standing went clothed in rich stuffs forbidden by law to those of lesser rank, in velvets and silks and cloth of gold, in furs of ermine and sable, her gowns cut in the elaborate fashions of the court, and worked with embroidery and trimmed with precious things. She wore jewels, rings and brooches, and collars of gold set with gems, and the tall and intricate headdresses that the noble women of that century carried like crowns. Her chambers were hung with rich tapestries, and her tables set with silver plate. And she travelled with a long train of attendants befitting her dignity. All of this was not mere vanity, though vanity surely played its part, but a serious matter of state, the outward show of greatness without which greatness was scarcely believed in. To dress and live below one's rank was to diminish oneself in the eyes of the world, and so the wealthy spent lavishly on display, on the clothes and jewels and household splendour that made their power visible. Anne, as a duchess and a king's sister, lived amid this calculated magnificence all her life, a figure of silk and ermine moving through the rich and ceremonious world of the court, her very appearance a proclamation of the blood royal that ran in her veins. Nowhere was the splendour and the ceremony of that age more on display than at the table, for the feast was one of the chief theatres of medieval greatness, a performance of wealth and hierarchy as much as a meal. In the hall of a noble house, the whole household gathered to dine, ranked along the tables in strict order of precedence. The lord and his family raised above the rest at the high table on its dais, the silver salt cellar marking the boundary between those who sat above it and those below. The food came in lavish abundance and variety, course after course of roasted meats and fowl and fish and rich, made dishes, spiced and coloured and sauced in the elaborate manner of the age. For the cooks of a great house laboured to astonish as much as to feed. At the grandest feasts there were marvels brought to the table, the elaborate sculptures of sugar and pastry called subtleties, fashioned into castles and beasts and allegories, set down before the diners to amaze them between the courses. All of it was governed by an intricate ceremony, the washing of hands, the carving done by men of rank, the serving conducted like a ritual. For to dine in a hall was to take part in a daily enactment of the order of the world, every person in their place, the bounty of the Lord flowing down through the ranks. Anne presided over such tables all her life, first as a daughter and then as the mistress of her own noble household, the feast a constant feature of her world, magnificent, hierarchical, ceremonious, the rich and ordered abundance of the medieval great laid out in the smoky candlelight of the hall. The marriage of Anne's sister Margaret carries us out for a moment onto the wider stage of Europe and reminds us that the House of York played its part not only in England but in the game of nations. Margaret was given, in a match of high policy and dazzling magnificence, to the Duke of Burgundy, who, though he bore only the title of Duke, was in truth one of the mightiest princes of the age, the ruler of a glittering collection of rich lands in what we would now call the Low Countries and eastern France, a realm whose wealth and splendour outshone many a kingdom. The court of Burgundy was the most magnificent in all of Christendom, the very fountainhead of fashion and chivalry and luxury, and Margaret of York went to it as its Duchess and wielded much power there. A patroness of art and learning and a tireless schemer on behalf of her own family back in England. The wedding had been a marvel of pageantry, weeks of feasting and tournaments and processions of a richness that astonished even that extravagant age. And the alliance mattered, for Burgundy was England's chief friend and France its sworn enemy, and the friendship of the Burgundian court would more than once prove the salvation of the Yorkist cause. Giving shelter to Edward when he was driven into exile and lending him the men and ships to win his throne back. So the family into which Anne had been born reached out, through her sister, into the very heart of continental power. And the quarrels of England were bound up with the rivalries of France and Burgundy in a web of policy that stretched across the sea. Anne herself never left England, so far as we know, but her blood sat on one of the foremost thrones of Europe, in the person of the sister, married to the Lord of Burgundy. That Burgundian court to which Anne's sister went was famous above all for one famous spectacle, the tournament, and the joust was the supreme entertainment of the chivalric world, a dazzling show of martial splendour in which the nobility acted out, in play, the warlike ideals it lived by. In the lists, the fenced enclosure where the contests were held, armoured knights on powerful war horses thundered at one another with levelled lances, striving to shatter their spears upon the foe or hurl him from the saddle, while the heralds cried their names and blazons, and the great folk watched from the stands in their finery. It was a sport of real danger. Men were maimed, and sometimes killed at it, but it was also a glittering social occasion, a festival of pageantry and display, the knights fighting for honour and for the favour of the watching ladies, who might bestow upon a champion some token of their regard. Whole days and weeks of such contests marked the great occasions of the age, the weddings and the treaties, and the high feasts. And the court of Burgundy raised the tournament to a peak of magnificence that all of Europe sought to imitate. The English court under Edward had its own famous jousters and its own grand tournaments, and the spectacle was part of the bright surface of Anne's world, the warlike nobility playing at war in a blaze of colour and courtesy, even as the real wars filled the same years with their very different and far uglier fighting. The tournament was chivalry in its holiday dress, the dream of honourable combat staged as entertainment, the gorgeous shadow that the brutal reality of the battlefield cast upon the playing fields of the great. For King Edward, having won his crown, set about stripping his enemies of everything they had, and the Duke of Exeter, as one of the most stubborn and dangerous of the Lancastrian lords, was stripped of more than most. He was attainted in Parliament, his titles forfeit and his vast estates confiscated to the crown, so that the proud Duke of Exeter, the Premier Duke of England, was left with nothing at all, a landless exile, living on the charity of foreign princes. And here the king did a thing both shrewd and, in its way, kind to his sister. The Exeter estates, instead of being kept by the crown or handed to some royal favourite, were granted to Anne herself. Her brother gave her the lands of the husband who had fought against their family, so that the wealth that should have been Exeter's now supported the wife he had abandoned to ruin. It was a clever stroke, keeping the vast inheritance within the royal family and providing handsomely for the king's sister. And it left Anne in the curious position of holding her own husband's confiscated estates, while the husband himself wandered the courts of Europe in poverty. The chroniclers preserved a single haunting image of how far Henry Holland fell. A man who had once been the Premier Duke of England, of blood almost royal, was seen in the Low Countries reduced to beggary, walking barefoot and ragged, it was said, begging his bread from door to door, a duke turned vagabond by the turning of the wheel. Whatever Anne felt for the man who had helped to kill her father, there is something almost unbearable in that picture. The mighty lord brought so low, and it stands as a kind of emblem of the whole pitiless age, in which the highest could be cast down to the very bottom in the space of a single year. The instrument of his ruin, the attainder, deserves a word. For it was the great weapon of these wars, and it hung over every family in them. To be attainted was to be condemned by Act of Parliament as a traitor, and it carried consequences that reached beyond death itself. The attainted man forfeited all his lands and titles to the crown, which was disaster enough, but worse, his blood was held to be corrupted, so that he could pass nothing to his children. His whole line cut off at a stroke from the inheritance of his fathers. It was a kind of legal annihilation, the erasing of a family from the rolls of the great, and it could be reversed only by a later act, restoring the blood, which the turning of fortune might or might not bring. The wars were a long succession of such attainders and reversals, families cast down and raised up again as fortune shifted, the same estates changing hands, again and again as one side, and then the other, gained the upper hand. And over the entire bloody, turning, unstable spectacle, the men of that age saw presiding the figure they called Fortune, who raised men to the heights, and then, on a whim, sent Fortune spinning, so that the same men were flung down to the depths. It was one of the favourite images of the medieval mind, that ever-turning emblem, and the Wars of the Roses might have been designed to illustrate it, so giddy and so cruel were the risings and the fallings. Henry Holland's life, from Premier Duke to barefoot beggar, was the wheel of fortune made visible, and so, in its quieter way, was Anne's. Lifted and cast down and lifted again by forces wholly beyond her control. The men and women of that age had a way of making sense of these dizzying risings and fallings, and it came to them from an old and much loved book of wisdom, written long before by a condemned philosopher awaiting his own death, which taught them to see the entire spectacle as the work of fortune and her wheel. That fickle goddess in the ancient teaching turned a wheel to which all the people of the world were bound, so that as it spun some were carried up to the heights of power and glory, while others, on the opposite side, were dragged down into the depths of misery and ruin, and then it turned once more, and those who had been high were cast down, and those who had been low were raised. The whole point of the image was that no one could trust to such a power, that her gifts of wealth and glory were never truly possessed, but only lent for a while, and that the wise man held them lightly, knowing that she would turn and take them away again, and set his heart instead on the things her spinning could not touch. It was a teaching made for an age like Anne's, in which the mighty were lifted up and flung down with such giddy speed, and men reached for it constantly to understand the chaos of their times. Anne's own father, the heir to a throne, dead in a winter field with a paper crown. Her husband, the Premier Duke, a barefoot beggar. Her brother, a fugitive in a fishing boat. Then a crowned king, then a fugitive again, then a king once more. The wheel turned and turned through all of her life, and the old philosophy gave her, and all her age, a way of looking at that spinning that was not mere despair, a wisdom that found, in the very unreliability of worldly things, a reason to hold to something deeper. Underlying all of it, all the titles and the armies and the turnings of fortune, was the land. For land was the true foundation of power in that society, the root from which everything else grew. A powerful lord's strength was measured in his acres, in the broad estates scattered across many counties from which flowed the rents and the dues and the loyalty of tenants that made him mighty. The land gave him his income, vast and steady, to spend on the household and the retainers and the display that proclaimed his greatness. The land gave him his men, the tenants who held their farms of him and owed him service and would follow him to war. The land gave him his roots in a district, the lordship over a countryside where his word was law and his castle, the centre of all things. This was why the inheritance of land was the obsession of that whole class. Why marriages were made and feuds were fought and attainders were dreaded, for to gain land was to gain power, and to lose it was to be cast into nothing. The Exeter estates that passed by the turning of the wars, from the ruined Henry Holland to the hands of Anne, were not merely a source of comfortable income, but the very substance of greatness, the thing that made their holder a power in the land. When Anne held those estates, she held real lordship, the command of men and rents and the affairs of a whole countryside, and when in time they passed to her daughter, they carried that lordship with them. The wars, beneath all their drama of crowns and battles, were in large part a vast and bloody quarrel over the ownership of England's land, and the men and women caught up in them rose and fell with the acres they could hold. In the midst of all this ruin, there was one fruit of the marriage, a child. Some years before the wars reached their height, when Anne was grown to a woman and the marriage had become a true one, she had borne her husband a daughter, their only child, a small daughter named Anne after her mother. And upon this small girl, the high affairs of the realm now came to bear, for she was, after all, the heiress to the vast Exeter inheritance that her mother now held. And an heiress of such wealth and such royal blood was a prize that the most powerful in the land would compete for. It was the king's own queen, Elizabeth Woodville, a woman famous for the relentless way she advanced her own large family, who reached out and seized the prize. The queen arranged for the little heiress, Anne's daughter, to be married to her own eldest son by her first marriage, a young man named Thomas Grey, and she is said to have paid a great sum of money to secure the match, snatching the rich York heiress for her own kin before any other family could claim her. So Anne's daughter was carried off into the orbit of the Queen's grasping relations, married as a girl to the Queen's son. Her fortune folded into the schemes of the Woodvilles. But the marriage came to nothing in the end, for the little girl, Anne Holland, the only infant of that long, unhappy marriage, died while she was still young, before she ever grew to womanhood or bore a child of her own. And so that line failed, and the vast inheritance came loose again, and the death of the young one left Anne, in time, with no living issue at all from her first marriage. The whole of it, the grand alliance, and the years of waiting, and the one daughter, come down at the last to a small grave and a fortune passing into other hands. The hand that had reached out to seize the little heiress, the Queen Elizabeth Woodville, was the subject of more resentment than almost anyone else in the kingdom, and her grasping after Anne's daughter was very much in character. The king's marriage to her had itself been a scandal that shook the realm, for Edward, who might have married any princess in Europe, had instead wedded in secret a beautiful English widow of modest birth, the daughter of a mere knight, raising her at a stroke to be Queen of England. And once she was queen, Elizabeth Woodville set about advancing her own large and hungry family with a single-mindedness that earned them the hatred of the older nobility. She had many brothers and sisters, and she found for them, one after another, the richest marriages and the highest places, marrying her young brother to an ancient dowager duchess, her sisters to the heirs of great earldoms, snapping up wardships and heiresses for her kin until it seemed the whole marriage market of the kingdom had been cornered by the Queen's relations. The carrying off of Anne's daughter for the Queen's son by her first marriage was one move in this long game, the securing of a great York inheritance for the Woodville interest. To the old nobility, it was all deeply galling. The spectacle of these upstarts, as they saw them, gathering to themselves the prizes that should have gone to better blood, and the resentment of the Woodvilles would, in time, help to bring the whole House of York crashing down. But that lay in the future. For now, the Queen had her way, as she usually did, and Anne's daughter was folded into the schemes of the Queen's family, A small piece moved across the board by a mistress hand. The buying and selling of marriages, of which the seizing of Anne's daughter was one example, was a regular and lucrative business in that age, and it bore especially hard upon sons and daughters left fatherless. For the marriage of an heir or an heiress was a prize of great value that the powerful competed to control. When a tenant of the crown died leaving an underage heir, the wardship of that child, the right to manage the estates and, crucially, to arrange the marriage, fell to the king, who might keep it, or far more often, sell it or grant it to some favoured person. To hold the wardship of a wealthy young heir or heiress was to hold a small fortune, for one could enjoy the income of the estates during the minority, and then marry the child to one's own son or daughter, or to the highest bidder, joining the broad inheritance to one's own family. So the children of the dead great were trafficked like the valuable property they were, their hands and their fortunes bought and bargained over while they were still in the nursery, married off to serve the interests of whoever had secured their wardship. It was a cold and mercenary business beneath its forms of family alliance, the turning of young ones into instruments of profit and advancement, and it fell hardest upon the young and the fatherless, who had no say at all in the disposing of their own lives. Anne herself had been married as a girl to serve her father's policy, and her daughter in turn was snatched up to serve the Queen's ambition. 2 generations of York girls handed across the board of the marriage market, and in this they were utterly typical of their rank and their age, in which a daughter was, before all else, a piece of valuable property to be advantageously bestowed. By now the marriage of Anne and Henry Holland had ceased, in any meaningful sense, to exist. The two of them had been formally separated for years, living wholly apart, the husband a fugitive abroad and the wife established at her brother's court as a noblewoman in her own right, holding the very lands that had been his. They were husband and wife only in the cold letter of the law, 2 people bound by a contract made when one of them was a child of 6. Divided now by war and treason and a father's blood and the long corrosion of a temper that by every sign had made Henry Holland a hard and frightening man to be tied to. We do not have the details of their private estrangement, for as ever, the chroniclers did not record the griefs of wives. But we can read the shape of it plainly enough in the public facts. A violent and unstable man, and a tainted traitor, a husband who had fought against her family in the field where her father died, set against a proud and capable woman who was the sister of the king and the holder of his estates, and who had every reason in the world to wish herself free of him. There was nothing left of the marriage but the chain, and Anne, as the years passed and her brother's throne grew secure, would come at last to find a way to strike the chain off. But before that, the wheel of the wars had one more great turn to make, and in that turning, Anne would play for once a part of her own. We should try to picture what Anne's life actually was in these years of her estrangement, for it was, in its outward form, a very comfortable one, whatever private loneliness it held. She was a great landed magnate in her own right, holding the broad Exeter estates that her brother had granted her, and the management of such an inheritance was a serious occupation, a matter of stewards and bailiffs and accounts, of rents and manors and the exercise of lordship over many hundreds of tenants. She kept her own household, a long train of servants and officers and ladies, and moved among her properties, and to and from the court as a woman of the first rank. She had her place in the ceremonies and festivities of her brother's reign, her precedence, her dignity, her wealth. In the eyes of the age she wanted for nothing. And yet she was a wife without a husband, a woman in her early 30s still bound by an indissoluble vow to a man she could not live with and would not have wished to. Her marriage, a dead thing that nonetheless held her fast, barring her from any other union and leaving her in a kind of suspended state. neither truly wedded nor free. For a woman of her age and rank, expected to be the ornament of a husband's house and the mother of his heirs, it was an anomalous and in some ways a lonely position, and it is no wonder that, when the chance at last came to be free of it, she seized that chance with both hands. But the freeing was still some years off, and in the meantime she lived as she had to, a lady of rank, with everything except the one thing she perhaps most wanted, which was a life of her own. The undoing of a marriage was no simple matter in that age, for the Church held marriage to be a sacrament and in principle indissoluble, a bond that only death could break. And yet marriages were undone, with some regularity among the great, and the means was the finding that the marriage had never been truly valid in the first place. The Church's law of marriage was a dense thicket of rules about who might lawfully wed whom, and chief among them were the rules of kinship, which forbade marriage between persons too closely related by blood or by other ties, and forbade it within a very wide circle indeed. Now, among the intermarried nobility of England, almost everyone of rank was related to almost everyone else within that forbidden circle, so that a large number of marriages were, strictly speaking, unlawful from the start unless a special dispensation had been obtained, and even where one had, grounds could often be found to question it. This gave the powerful a door out of an unwanted marriage, the argument that some impediment of kinship or some flaw in the original dispensation made the union void, that it had never, in the eyes of God, been a marriage at all. It was by some such finding that Anne's marriage to the Duke of Exeter was at last dissolved, declared, in effect, never to have been valid, and a chain that had bound her since childhood ruled to have been no true chain after all. Such proceedings needed influence and money and the will of the powerful behind them, and Anne, as the sister of the monarch, had all three. But the door existed, and she went through it and emerged a free woman, able at last to make a marriage of her own choosing. For the wars were not finished, even after Towton, and in the year 1470 the wheel made its most astonishing turn of all. The man who had done more than any other to put Edward upon the throne, the mighty Earl of Warwick, the king's own cousin and greatest subject. The man history remembers as the kingmaker fell out bitterly with the monarch he had made, and in his fury he did the unthinkable. He joined hands with his old enemy, the exiled Queen Margaret of Anjou, the very woman whose cause he had spent years destroying, and together they raised an army and fell upon Edward. And they caught him so off guard that the sovereign of England had to flee his own kingdom in a fishing boat, escaping across the sea to take refuge with his sister Margaret in Burgundy. And so, by a turn of fortune that no one could have foreseen, the broken old King Henry VI was lifted out of his prison in the Tower and set back upon the throne, the Lancastrian cause restored as if from the grave, and the family of York cast down once more into exile and ruin. In that brief Lancastrian summer, the Duke of Exeter came back into his own. Henry Holland, Anne's husband, returned from the cold seasons of his exile to fight once more for the Lancastrian king, his fortunes risen again with the rising of his cause, the wheel that had cast him into beggary now carrying him back toward the top. For a few short months it must have seemed to him that the long nightmare was over and the world set right at last. The man at the centre of this astonishing reversal, the Earl of Warwick, was one of the most remarkable figures of the whole age, and his story is worth knowing, for it shows how giddy and treacherous the politics of these years had become. Warwick was the greatest of the Nevilles, Anne's own cousin through her mother, and for years he had been the chief prop of the dynasty of York, the man whose wealth and armies and restless energy had done as much as anyone to put Edward on the throne. He was fabulously rich, the lord of vast estates, a famous soldier and an even more famous keeper of open house, feeding hundreds at his tables and binding men to him with a generosity that made him beloved across the country. For a time, he had been the real power behind the young king, the over-mighty subject whose word moved the kingdom. But Edward, as he grew into his kingship, would not be governed, and the two fell out over the crown's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, over the rise of the Queen's grasping family, over the direction of policy at home and abroad. And Warwick, finding himself thrust from the centre of power he felt was his by right, turned with breathtaking audacity to destroy the very king he had made. He drove Edward from the throne and restored the old enemy Henry, and for a few months he ruled as the master of the kingdom once more. It was the supreme example of the lawless ambition of the mighty in that age. The man who made a monarch and then unmade him, and his nickname has come down the centuries as a kind of marvel, the kingmaker, the subject so mighty he could give and take away the crown itself. And in his treason, Warwick had help from across the sea, for the wars of England were never wholly England's own affair, but were watched and meddled with by the powers of the continent, who found it useful to keep their island neighbour weak and divided. Chief among these meddlers was the King of France, a strange, clever, secretive man whom his own age nicknamed the Universal Spider, for the way he sat at the centre of a vast web of intrigue, spinning plots and pulling threads across all of Europe. It suited France very well that England should tear itself apart, for an England busy with its own civil wars was an England that could not renew its old dream of conquest across the Channel. And so the French king worked to keep the quarrel alive, sheltering exiles, lending money, brokering the alliances that turned the wheel. It was the Spider King of France who, in the sudden reversal, brought together the two bitterest enemies, the rebel Warwick and the exiled Lancastrian Queen Margaret, and patched up an alliance between them that no one could have imagined, and sent them back to England to drive out Edward. The friendship of Burgundy answered the enmity of France, the two great continental powers backing the rival English factions, so that the struggle of York and Lancaster became, in part, a piece in the larger game of Europe. Anne's family rode the currents of that game, whether they would or no, lifted and cast down partly by the schemes of foreign princes, and the alliances and betrayals of the continent reached all the way into the fortunes of the children of York. But it was Anne's family that held the field in the end, and in the great crisis of those months, Anne herself, for once in her quiet life, took a hand in the affairs of the realm, for the Yorkist cause did not simply wait abroad for fortune to turn. Its women went to work. The old matriarch Cecily Neville, Anne's mother, and her daughters, the sisters of the exiled king, set about the patient, dangerous task of knitting the family back together and preparing the ground for Edward's return. And the prize they aimed at was their own brother George, the Duke of Clarence, the charming and faithless middle brother, who in his discontent had thrown in his lot with Warwick against Edward and married Warwick's daughter. If Clarence could be brought back to his brother's side, the Lancastrian cause would be fatally weakened, and Edward's return would have a chance. And here, in the one clear political act of her whole recorded life, Anne played her part. Working with her mother and her sisters, she helped to reach out to her wavering brother, to argue and to plead and to remind him where his blood and his interest truly lay, to draw him back from the brink of his betrayal. It was the women of York, Cecily and Anne and their sisters, who helped to turn Clarence's heart, and turn it they did. When Edward landed back in England in the spring of 1471, his brother Clarence came over to him with all his men, and the balance tipped, and the road to the throne lay open once more. It is the only time we glimpse Anne acting upon the great stage of her age, and she acted as she had lived. For the line of York, the brother she helped to win back, George of Clarence, was the most slippery and least trustworthy of all the children of York, and his story is a small tragedy in its own right. Charming, handsome, eloquent, and bottomlessly discontented, Clarence could never reconcile himself to standing in his brother's shadow, and his envy made him a traitor more than once. He had joined the Kingmaker's rebellion against Edward, turning his coat against his own blood. And even after his family drew him home, he never truly learned loyalty or contentment. In the years of peace that followed, he quarrelled and schemed and overreached, dabbling in fresh intrigues and railing against the king, grasping after lands and marriages that were not his to claim, until at last even Edward's long patience with him wore through. He was arrested, charged with treason before the Parliament, and condemned, and he met his end privately within the Tower. Drowned, the strange story went, in a butt of sweet wine, an end as bizarre as his restless and discontented life had been. But all of that lay a little ahead, beyond the span of Anne's own days. For she would be gone before her brother destroyed himself. She did not live to see this nearest, in age of her younger brothers, brought to so squalid a finish by the family he could never be content within. In him. As in so many of the children of York, the same fierce blood that lifted them so high drove them also, in the end, to their own undoing. The reckoning came at the village of Barnet, just north of London, on a foggy Easter morning in April of the year 1471. There Edward met the army of Warwick, and in the murk and confusion of that strange battle, fought half-blind in a thick spring fog, the Kingmaker himself was killed, and his cause died with him. And on that field, among the lords fighting for the losing Lancastrian side, was Anne's husband, the Duke of Exeter, and Barnet very nearly finished him. He was struck down in the press, gravely and grievously wounded, and left for dead amid the heaps of the slain, stripped, it was said, by the looters who picked over the battlefield, lying senseless and bleeding in the cold. By any reasonable account, he should have died there. But he did not. Some servant or friend found him still breathing amid the dead, and he was carried away in secret and hidden, and brought at last to sanctuary in the abbey at Westminster, where the law could not touch him, and there, slowly, against the odds, his ruined body mended. The Duke of Exeter had been to the very threshold of death and come back, but he came back to nothing. Warwick was dead, the Lancastrian army shattered, and within weeks the cause was finished forever, for Edward destroyed the last Lancastrian host at the Battle of Tewkesbury, where Queen Margaret's only son, the young prince for whom she had fought so long and so fiercely, was killed, and the poor old king himself, Henry VI, was quietly put to death in the Tower. A few days later, the last flicker of the family of Lancaster snuffed out in the dark. The wars, for a generation, were over, and the family of York had won them, and Anne's brother Edward sat secure upon his throne at last. The extinction of the House of Lancaster in those few weeks of the spring of 1471 was a matter of grim completeness, and it closed a chapter that had been open for 2 generations. At Tewkesbury, the last Lancastrian army was destroyed, and with it died the young prince who had been the whole hope of the Lancastrian side, the only son of the fierce Queen Margaret of Anjou, cut down at 17, either in the rout or, as some said, in cold blood afterward, so that the line of succession the Lancastrians had fought for was severed in a single afternoon. The captured lords who had taken sanctuary in the abbey were dragged out and beheaded. And then, in the Tower of London, the poor old king himself, Henry VI, the gentle holy man who had been the unwitting source of so much blood, was quietly murdered in the night. Dispatched men had little doubt, on the order of the triumphant Edward, who could not safely leave a rival king alive, now that the rival's son was dead. With the father and the son both gone, the Lancastrian cause was finished, root and branch, its hopes without a claimant, its hopes in the grave. The Queen Margaret, who had fought so long and so ferociously, was taken prisoner, a broken woman who had lost husband and son and crown together, and would end her days in poverty and exile, a ghost of the lioness she had been. The wars that had begun before Anne was old enough to understand them had reached, at last, a kind of ending, and her family had won. The whole bloody contest had come down, after 16 years, to the triumph of the dynasty into which she had been born. As for the fierce queen who had fought for so long against the line of York, the Lioness Margaret of Anjou, her end was a slow fading that makes a fitting coda to the ruin of her cause. Taken prisoner after the destruction of her army and the death of her son, she was held captive in England for some years. A broken and grieving woman who had lost everything she had spent her life fighting for, her husband murdered, her only child cut down, her cause extinguished forever. In time she was ransomed by the King of France, that same Spider King whose schemes had woven through so much of the struggle, and allowed to return to the land of her birth. But she went back, not in triumph, but in poverty and defeat. A queen without a crown or a country, living out her last days on the charity of her French kin, a faded and sorrowful figure, far from the events she had once commanded. She died at last in obscurity, the woman who had been the very soul of the Lancastrian struggle, the most formidable enemy the Yorkist cause ever faced, ending her days as a poor and forgotten exile. There is a kind of grim symmetry in it, for she had shown little mercy in her day of power, and the wheel that she had ridden so high carried her down at the last to the very bottom, stripped of all she had loved and all she had fought for. Her long and bitter war with Anne's family was over, and she had lost it utterly, and the family of York, against which she had hurled her whole fierce nature for so many years, had outlasted and destroyed her. The decade that followed this final victory was the quietest and most settled of her whole adult life, and indeed of the kingdom's. A decade of peace bought by all that blood. With Lancaster destroyed, and no rival left alive to challenge him, Anne's brother Edward reigned secure at last, and the civil war seemed truly over, its quarrels settled, its scores paid, the realm sinking gratefully into calm. The king grew stout and pleasure-loving in these easy days, feasting and building and enjoying the throne he had fought so hard to win, and the leading families, exhausted by a generation of strife, were content for a time to live in peace. It was in this lull, this golden evening of Edward's reign, that Anne lived out her own last chapter, freed from her first marriage and wed to the man she loved, settled in her brother's favour, a noble woman in a kingdom finally at rest. No one then could have guessed that the peace was a false dawn, that the family of York, having destroyed all its enemies, would shortly turn its terrible energies inward and destroy itself, brother against brother, uncle against nephew, in a final spasm of treachery and murder that would sweep the whole dynasty away within a dozen years of Anne's death. But that ruin was still hidden in the future, and Anne did not live to see it. She knew only the peace, the long quiet evening after the wars, and in that quiet she found, briefly, her own happiness. It was, in the kindness of its timing, the best decade in which she could have lived and died. For all his pleasure-loving ease in those later years, Anne's brother Edward proved, when he troubled to apply himself, a more than able king. And the peace he gave the country was not merely the exhaustion after war, but the fruit of real and capable rule. He set himself to restore the order and the justice that had collapsed in the years of strife, bringing the overmighty lords to heel, making the king's law run again in places where it had been flouted, so that ordinary men could once more look to the crown for protection rather than to whichever mighty lord held sway in their district. He took a close and personal interest in trade, in the commerce of his merchants and the wealth of his city of London, encouraging the traffic that brought riches into the kingdom, and even, it was said, dabbling in trade himself, a king who understood that money was the sinew of power. He mended the broken finances of the crown, gathering its scattered revenues and living, by the end, within his means, so that he died, almost uniquely among the monarchs of that age. Not deep in debt, but solvent and even rich. And his reign saw new things stirring in the land. Among them, in the very years of Anne's last chapter, the arrival of a wonderful new craft, the printing of books. Set up within the precincts of Westminster, the beginning of a quiet revolution that would in time change the world more deeply than all the battles of the wars. Anne lived her final years in this reviving kingdom, under the rule of the brother whose throne she had helped to secure, a realm climbing slowly back toward prosperity and order after the long fever of the wars. It was, whatever its hidden dangers, a good time and a good place to be a high-born lady, and Anne lived it as one, that city of London, which Anne knew well and where her family kept their riverside stronghold, was unlike anywhere else in the kingdom. A world unto itself, and the one true city in a land of small market towns. By the measure of the age it was vast, a teeming press of many tens of thousands of souls crowded within its ancient walls and spilling beyond them. The greatest concentration of people and wealth and trade in the entire realm. The River Thames was its life, a broad highway crowded with the ships and barges that carried the commerce of half of Europe to its quays. And across the river ran the famous bridge, that marvel lined with houses and shops along its whole length, the only crossing for miles and a wonder in its own right. Within the walls, the narrow streets ran thick with craftsmen and merchants and apprentices, the guilds and companies that governed the city's trades, the markets and the workshops, the great churches and the merchant halls, the whole roaring, stinking, magnificent machinery of a medieval metropolis. London was rich, and London was proud, and London was powerful, jealous of its ancient liberties and its right to govern itself, and no one who would rule England could afford to ignore the will of its citizens. As the wars had shown when the city shut its gates against a queen and opened them to a king. It was the beating commercial heart of the kingdom, the place where wealth and power and people gathered as nowhere else, and Anne's family's hold upon it, through their noble house upon its riverbank, was no small part of their strength. The London of her day is gone now, swept away by fire and time, but in her age it stood, the one city of the English, loud and crowded and alive, for Henry Holland. The end of the Lancastrian cause meant the end of everything. Dragged from his sanctuary, he was shut up as a prisoner in the Tower of London, a broken and defeated man, his cause dead, his hopes gone. Kept under lock and key by the brother of the wife he had married 30 years before. And it was now, with her husband a ruined prisoner and the war won and her brother's throne secure, that Anne at last moved to free herself. In the autumn of 1472, after more than a quarter of a century bound by the vows made over her when she was a young one of 6, Anne obtained the dissolution of her marriage to the Duke of Exeter. The union that the wars had hollowed out was now formally undone. The chain struck off at last, and Anne, in her early 30s, was a free woman, no longer the wife of the man who had warred against her house. It was, in its way, a remarkable thing for a woman of that age to achieve, the deliberate and successful ending of a great marriage, and she could not have done it without the power of her brother, the monarch behind her. But she wanted it, and she got it, and the wanting of it tells us how thoroughly the marriage had died. The mighty fortress in which her husband was now confined, the Tower of London, deserves a word, for it was one of the most formidable and many-sided buildings in the entire kingdom, and it looms in the background of so much of this family's story. The Tower was many things at once. It was a mighty fortress, the strongest castle in the south of England. its great white keep raised by the conquering kings centuries before to overawe the city of London at its feet. It was a royal palace, where kings lodged in state, and from which, by ancient custom, they rode out to their coronations. It was the kingdom's chief arsenal and treasury, the keeping place of the crown's arms and jewels and records, and even the home of a strange royal menagerie of wild beasts, lions, and the like, kept there as a marvel. And it was, above all and most darkly, a prison, the place where the mighty and dangerous were held, and where, in the shadows of its towers, more than one inconvenient prisoner met a quiet and unrecorded end. It was here that the old King Henry VI had been murdered in the night, and here that other tragedies of this family would unfold in the years to come. To be shut in the tower was to be in the very heart of the kingdom's power, and at the same time wholly in its grip, held fast in the strongest and most fateful of all the realm's strongholds. There the Duke of Exeter sat out his captivity, the once mighty Lancastrian a prisoner in the fortress of his enemies, while the wife who had freed herself of him took up, beyond its walls, the new life she had chosen. There remained the strange matter of the husband's end, and it is a dark one. The Duke of Exeter did not stay forever in the tower. In time he was released, and in 1475 he even went abroad in the train of his royal brother-in-law, joining the great expedition that King Edward led across the sea to make war upon France. But on the voyage home from that campaign, Henry Holland, the former Duke of Exeter, the man who had survived Towton and Barnet and beggary and prison, met his death in the most quiet and sinister way of all. He was found drowned in the narrow sea between England and France, his body in the cold water, and no one could quite say how he had come to be there. The whispers ran, then and ever since, that it was no accident, that the dangerous and inconvenient old Lancastrian had been quietly disposed of, thrown overboard into the dark water by men, acting, perhaps, on a word from the sovereign who would be glad to be rid of him. We will never know the truth of it, for the sea keeps its secrets. But it was a fitting end, somehow, for a man whose whole existence had been spent on the wrong side of the wheel, dying obscurely in the cold water on the way home from another man's war, the once mighty Duke of Exeter slipping unremarked beneath the waves. Whatever Anne felt to learn of it, she was, by then, already free of him, and already, it seems, in love with another man. The manner of Exeter's death opens a small dark window onto the realities of power in that age. For the quiet removal of an inconvenient man was a thing that happened, and everyone knew it happened, and very few questions were asked. A defeated enemy who could not be left at large, but could not easily be executed without scandal, might simply die. Of a fever in prison, of a fall, of a drowning at sea, and the world would shrug and move on. Henry Holland was exactly such a man, a great Lancastrian of royal blood, whose very existence was a faint and lingering danger. A rallying point that might, in some future turn of the wheel, be used against the House of York. He had been spared the axe, perhaps out of some lingering respect for his blood, perhaps because he was the king's own brother-in-law, however unwillingly. But a man who slips beneath the waves on a dark crossing troubles no one further, and there were many who found it more than convenient that the former Duke of Exeter should drown on his way home from France. We cannot prove the dark suspicion, and we never will, but it sits well with everything we know of the cold practicalities of that world, in which kings did what they had to do to make their thrones secure, and in which a quiet death at sea asked far fewer awkward questions than a public execution. So passed Henry Holland, the husband of Anne's childhood, the enemy of her house, the violent and unlucky Duke who had spent his whole life on the losing side into the cold water and out of her story for good. The narrow sea in which he died was a more dangerous place than we, who cross it now in an hour without a thought. Can easily imagine, the channel between England and France was the great moat that guarded the kingdom and the great road that connected it to the continent. Crossed constantly by merchants and soldiers and pilgrims and kings, and it was crossed in small wooden ships at the mercy of the wind and the weather, vessels that could be becalmed for days or driven onto rocks or swamped by a sudden storm. Drowning was a common death in that age, and a crossing of the channel was always a venture with some real risk in it, undertaken with a prayer and a commending of the soul to God. So a man found drowned on the return from France was not, in itself, a thing to raise great suspicion. For the sea took men often enough by simple misadventure. That is part of what made it such a convenient end for one whom powerful men might wish quietly gone, that a drowning could so easily be no more than it seemed, an ordinary peril of an ordinary crossing. Whatever the truth of Henry Holland's death, whether the sea took him by chance or by design, it took him in a way that the age was well used to, swallowed up in the cold grey water that had carried so many others down. The moat of England closing over the head of the ruined Duke as it had closed over so many humbler men before him. For the truest turn in all of Anne's story is the last one, and it is the gentlest. For after a lifetime spent as a piece in other people's games, married as an infant to serve her father's politics, bound for 30 years to a man she could not love, Anne, at the last, chose for herself. The man she chose was no mighty lord, no prince of the blood, no piece in any dynastic game, but a knight of her brother's own household, a man named Sir Thomas St. Leger. He was a loyal servant of King Edward, a Yorkist to the core who had fought for the family at Barnet and Tewkesbury, a capable and trusted man. But he was, by the measure of the age, far beneath her. She was a duchess and the sister of a king, of the blood royal of England. He was a mere knight, a household man, a person of no great birth at all. For such a woman to marry such a man was to marry far down the ladder. And in the harsh reckoning of medieval rank, it was a bold and startling step. But Anne had spent her entire life ruled by rank and blood and the cold calculations of others, and she had seen where all of it led. To beggary and butchery and the cruel turning of the wheel, and she had buried a father and a brother and a daughter, and lived 30 years, chained to a man who warred against her family. And now, free at last and past her youth, she did the one thing that was truly her own. She married the man she wanted. Somewhere in the early 1470s, with the marriage to Exeter undone, Anne became the wife of Thomas St. Leger, and the documents of her brother's reign show the two of them together. The king's sister and her household knight, a match made not for advantage, but for affection. The one free choice in a life that had been, until then, all duty and constraint. We should not pass too lightly over how bold a step this marriage was, for in the rigid world of medieval degree, it was very nearly a scandal. Marriages among the mighty were vertical things, made upward or sideways, never downward if it could be helped. And for a king's sister, a woman of the blood royal, to take as her husband a simple household knight was to overturn the whole careful order of precedence that governed that age. People of Anne's rank married dukes and earls and foreign princes, not the gentlemen of their brothers' households. That she did so anyway, and that her brother the king allowed it, tells us two things. It tells us that this was, almost certainly, a love match, for there was no other reason on earth for such a woman to marry such a man, no land or alliance or advantage to be gained, nothing but her own desire. And it tells us that Edward, for all his calculation, had a soft spot for marriages of the heart, having made one himself when he wedded his own commoner queen against all advice. He had set the precedent, and he let his sister follow it. The man she chose, Thomas St. Leger, was no nobody, a capable and rising man of the crown's household, trusted with offices and missions, a knight of standing, if not of greatness. But the gulf of rank between them was vast, and Anne crossed it deliberately, choosing the man over the match, the person over the position, in a way that almost no woman of her birth ever got the chance to do. It is the most human note we know about her, and the most telling, this late and deliberate reaching after a lifetime of being given to others, for a happiness of her own choosing. For a few short years then, Anne had what she had never had before, which was a marriage of her own choosing, a husband she had taken for herself rather than been handed to. And we may hope, though the chroniclers do not tell us, that those were happy years, the happiest of her life. She was a noble woman, still, the king's sister, secure in her brother's favour, holding her lands, established at court, and now wed to a man she had chosen, and who, by every sign, was devoted to her. After a lifetime spent as the property of her family's ambitions, she had carved out, at the last, a small space that was truly her own. And in that space she conceived a child, the child of her own free marriage, and it is here that the story turns one final time and turns cruelly. For the very thing that should have been her reward became the instrument of her death. In the deep midwinter of the year 1476, Anne went into labour with the child of Thomas St. Leger, and she was delivered of a daughter, a living girl, who was given, as the firstborn of that family always seemed to be, the name Anne. But the mother did not survive the bearing of her. Whether from the bleeding, or the fever, or the simple grinding violence of medieval childbirth, which killed women of every rank without mercy, and against which no wealth or station offered the least protection, Anne sickened and weakened. Within a day or two of the birth, she died. She was 36 years old. There is a terrible ordinariness to that ending, and it is part of what makes it linger. Here was a woman who had lived through the bloodiest civil war in English history, who had lost a father and a brother to the sword, who had been chained to one of the most dangerous men of the age and had freed herself from him by her own will, who had touched the affairs of crowns and kingdoms, and who had at the very last won for herself the single thing she truly wanted, a marriage of love. And then she died, not by any enemy's hand, not in any vast catastrophe of state, but in the most common and most womanly way of all, in childbed, undone by the bearing of a child, the same quiet death that took so many thousands of women of her age, the mighty and the humble alike. The wars had not killed her, the wheel of fortune had not killed her. In the end, it was the plainest fact of a woman's life that killed her, and her newborn daughter survived her, and Anne of York, the eldest child of the Yorkist cause, the sister of two kings, was carried to her grave. The carrying of a noble person to the grave was itself a solemn and stately business, surrounded with ceremony as everything in that age was surrounded with ceremony. The body of the noble departed was prepared and wrapped and brought, often in slow procession, to the church where it would lie, attended by mourners in black and lit by a blaze of candles, for light was thought to comfort and honour the departing soul. There were masses sung for the dead, and the tolling of bells, and the giving of alms to the poor, who would pray in return for the soul of the one who had died, so that a grand funeral set going at once a whole machinery of prayer on behalf of the departed. The greatest in rank were laid in tombs within the churches themselves, beneath carved effigies or engraved brasses that kept their memory and asked the prayers of those who passed. And the founding of chantries and the endowing of masses carried that work of prayer on, sometimes for generations, sometimes, in intention at least, forever. For the medieval mind death was not an ending, but a passage, and the rites that surrounded it were meant to ease that passage, to speed the soul on its way, and to bind the living and the dead together in the long work of remembrance and prayer. So Anne was carried to her grave with such rites as befitted a king's sister, brought to the great chapel at Windsor amid candles and mourning and the singing of masses, laid among the royal dead, and given over to the prayers that her husband would make endless in her memory. The ceremony of her ending was the ceremony of her whole world, stately, religious, and turned wholly toward the life beyond. The death that took her was the great silent killer of women in that age, and it is worth understanding how heavily it lay upon every woman's life, queen and cottager alike. Childbirth in the medieval world was attended by no medicine that could help, and every danger that could harm. There were no remedies for the bleeding that would not stop, no understanding of the infections that crept in afterward and burned a new mother away in fever, no way to save a labour that had gone wrong, save the rough skill of the midwives and the mercy of God. A noblewoman would be brought to her chamber for her lying in some weeks before her time, the room darkened and hung with rich cloth and sealed against the air that was thought to be dangerous. And there, attended only by women, she would wait out her confinement and face her ordeal. The church surrounded the entire business with prayer, for everyone understood the peril of it. They went into their labour having confessed and prepared their souls as if for death, since dying was a real and frequent visitor to the birthing chamber, and the bearing of a child was, for the medieval woman, very likely the most dangerous thing she would ever do, more dangerous by far than a man's going to war, and undertaken not once but again and again across her childbearing years. Great ladies died of it as readily as poor ones, for no amount of wealth or rank could buy safety from it. That this was the death that found Anne after she had survived the wars and the ruin and the long imprisonment of her first marriage is a bitter irony. But it is also the most ordinary fact in the world, the fate that waited for women everywhere, and that she met as countless thousands of her sisters met it in a darkened room attended by women in the bearing of a child. She was buried in the great chapel of St. George, within the walls of Windsor Castle, one of the holiest and most splendid of all the royal churches of England, the very heart of the chivalry of the realm. And there her chosen husband, Thomas St. Leger, the household knight she had stepped down so far to marry, gave her a last gift that speaks more eloquently of what had passed between them than any chronicle could. Some years after she died, he founded, in that chapel, a chantry, a small private chapel within the great one, and he endowed it so that 2 priests should sing there, day after day and on without end, masses for the soul of Anne, his wife, forever. 2 priests singing for her soul forevermore. It was the gesture of a man who had loved his wife, this provision for endless prayer over her grave. And it has a quiet eloquence that cuts through all the noise of the wars and the politics and the affairs of state, the simple grief of a husband who had married for love and lost her too soon, and who wanted her, remembered and prayed for as long as the chapel should stand. A brass was set up in her memory, and on it she is named, simply and proudly, as Anne, Duchess of Exeter, sister to the noble King Edward IV, and there she has lain at Windsor through all the centuries since, in the company of kings. The place where they laid her was no ordinary church, and the choice of it speaks of her standing to the very end. The chapel of St. George at Windsor was, and is, one of the most magnificent and sacred buildings in all of England, the spiritual home of the Order of the Garter, that most exclusive brotherhood of knights, founded by an earlier king to be the very flower of English chivalry. To be buried there was a high honour, a station among the elect of the realm, and in those very years, Anne's own brother, the king, was pouring his wealth into the rebuilding of the chapel on a scale of dazzling splendour, raising the soaring fan, vaulted nave that men still marvel at, meaning it to be a fit resting place for his own dynasty. But it was the smaller, more private foundation within that great chapel that mattered most to the man who made it, the little chantry where two priests were to sing forever for Anne's soul. And to understand the depth of that gift, we must understand what the medieval mind believed about the departed. They believed, with their whole hearts, in purgatory, at the place of cleansing where the souls of the faithful dead were held and purified before they could enter heaven, suffering for a time in proportion to the sins of their lives. And they believed, just as firmly, that the living could help the dead, that the prayers and the masses of those left behind could reach across into purgatory and shorten the soul's suffering and speed its passage into bliss. This was the reason for the chantry, that peculiar institution of the age, an endowment of lands and money set aside to pay priests to sing masses, day after day, year after year, for a named soul, easing its way through the fires of purgatory by the endless repetition of holy prayer. To found a chantry of two priests singing forever was therefore not a mere monument of stone and brass, but a living engine of salvation, a perpetual labour of love performed for the soul of the dead, the most precious gift that one who remained could give to one who had gone. That is what Thomas St. Leger gave to Anne, his wife. He arranged for prayer to be made for her soul by two priests, without ceasing, for as long as the chapel should stand, her husband's grief and devotion translated into the surest help the medieval age knew how to give, an endless singing in the candlelight for the woman he had chosen and lost. Edward himself would be buried there within a few years of his sister, and kings and queens of England would be laid there in the centuries to come, so that Anne lies, as her brass proudly proclaims, in the company of kings, among the greatest in the land. For a woman whose life had held so much loss and so much constraint, there is a kind of vindication in that resting place. The proud daughter of York gathered at the last into the very heart of the royal magnificence of her house. In the chapel, her brother was making the jewel of his reign. That chapel and its order of knights stood for an ideal that hung over the whole of Anne's violent age, the great dream of chivalry. And it is worth weighing that dream against the reality she lived. Chivalry was the code by which the warrior nobility of that society claimed to live, a lofty ideal of honour and courage and courtesy, of the strong protecting the weak, of mercy to the fallen, and faith to one's lord, and reverence to God and to noble ladies. The Knights of the Garter were meant to be the very flower of it, bound in a holy brotherhood of valour and honour. And there was something real in the dream, a genuine striving, in the best of them, toward a nobility that was more than mere force. But the wars Anne lived through showed how thin that bright code could wear when set against the hard realities of power. The same age that founded orders of chivalry and held tournaments of dazzling courtesy also struck the head from a dead duke and crowned it with paper, murdered a holy old king in the dark, cut down boys fleeing a lost field, and drowned inconvenient men in the cold sea. The ideal and the reality ran side by side, the soaring dream of honour and the brutal practice of a struggle to the death. And the men of that age seem to have held both in their minds at once, without much sense of the contradiction. Anne lived her life in the space between the two, in an age that sang of honour and practised butchery, and perhaps the truest thing to say of her is that she kept, through all of it, a kind of quiet personal honour of her own, a faithfulness to her house, and a steadiness under suffering that owed more to the real spirit of the chivalric dream than many a belted knight who wore its badge. The whole proud world of that nobility was held together and made legible by a peculiar art that we have largely lost, the art of heraldry, the science of coats of arms, and it is worth understanding. For it was the very language of identity in Anne's age. In an age where most could not read, and where a lord upon the battlefield was hidden head to foot in steel, men knew one another by their arms. The patterns of colour and device painted upon the shield, and woven upon the surcoat, and flown upon the banner, each family bearing its own unique design, passed down and combined and quartered according to strict and intricate rules. To bear arms was the very mark of gentility, and a man's coat of arms told, to those who could read it, the whole story of his blood, the families he descended from and married into, his place in the vast web of the nobility. The keepers and masters of this law were the heralds, officers learned in the arms of every house, who marshalled the great ceremonies and proclaimed the combatants at tournaments and identified the noble dead upon the stricken field after a battle, walking among the slain to read in their broken shields the names of the fallen great. Anne's own house bore its famous badges, the falcon and the fetterlock, the white rose, the sun in splendour her brother had taken, and these devices were everywhere about her age, carved in stone and worked in glass and stitched upon cloth, the silent visible language of rank and blood. To move through that age was to move through a forest of such signs, each one speaking, to those who knew the art, of lineage and alliance and the long proud genealogies of the great, and perhaps, in the strange reckoning of her age, there was a mercy in the timing of her death, for it spared her the very worst. Anne died in 1476, while her brother Edward still reigned in splendour, and the dynasty of York stood, to all appearances, triumphant and secure at the summit of the realm. She did not live to see what came after, and what came after was the final, devouring tragedy of her family. She did not see her treacherous brother Clarence put to death a few years later by the very king he could never be loyal to. She did not see her brother Edward die suddenly in his prime, leaving two small sons. She did not see her youngest brother, the little Richard, who had been born at Fotheringhay when she was a married girl, take the crown for himself and reign as King Richard III. And she did not see those two small princes, her own nephews, vanish forever into the Tower of London. And she did not live to see the very last act, the day at Bosworth Field when Richard, the last York king, was killed in battle and the crown was struck from the dead and the family of York, which had cost so many of her blood so much, was swept away at last by a new dynasty. Anne was spared all of it. She went to her grave while the dream still held. The eldest child of York laid to rest before the dream turned to ash, and there is a kind of grace in that the first of them should not have had to watch the ruin of the rest. Her line, though, did not end. The daughter whose birth had killed her, the infant Anne St. Leger, lived and grew, and because her uncle the sovereign had carefully arranged that the Exeter inheritance should pass to any child Anne might bear, that little girl grew up a great heiress, and married well into the noble house of Manners, and from her came earls and a long line of descendants, who carried the blood of York and of the proud daughter who had endured so much, down through the generations and into ages she could never have imagined. The eldest daughter of the line of York, who had been a piece on the board for all of her early life, who had been married to her family's enemy and bound to him through war and ruin, and who had freed herself and chosen love at the last, left behind her a thread of life that ran on long after the leading houses and the bloody battles had passed into the dust of history. Of her chosen husband, Thomas St. Leger, a last word should be said, for his devotion to her did not end with her death, and his own end was bound up with the final ruin of the family she had served. After Anne died, he never married again, though he lived another 7 years, and he kept her memory with the founding of that chantry at Windsor, the endless masses for the soul of the wife he had loved. He remained close to her brother the king, trusted and employed and honoured, for as long as Edward lived. But when Edward died, and the throne was seized by Anne's youngest brother, the king we know as Richard III, Thomas St. Leger did not make his peace with the new order. He threw in his lot with a rising against Richard, and when that rising failed, he was taken and put to death, beheaded for his treason in the autumn of the year 1483. It is one of the small mercies of the way Anne's life fell that she was spared all knowledge of it. For she had been 7 years in her grave by then, and never had to learn that the man she had chosen would die upon the block in the wreck of her own family's fortunes. There is a story, told in later ages, of Anne pleading with her brother Richard for her husband's life, a touching scene of a sister begging mercy of a king. But it cannot be true, for she was long dead before there was any life to plead for, and the imagined scene belongs to legend, not to history. The truth is plainer and sadder. She died first, in her childbed, and never knew what became of her chosen husband, and that ignorance was, perhaps, a kindness. So what are we to make of her? This woman who lived at the very centre of the most dramatic struggle in English history, and yet has been so largely forgotten, overshadowed by her brilliant and terrible brothers, the kings and the usurper, whose names everyone knows. She left no great monument of her own, fought no battles, ruled no kingdom, wrote no words that survive. She was, for most of her days, exactly what her age made of its women, an instrument of other people's ambitions, married off as a child, used as a piece of policy, expected to endure whatever the men of her family and the turning of fortune laid upon her. And endure she did, with a steadiness that the records let us glimpse only in outline. A daughter of York who kept faith with her house through the worst that the wars could do, who lost her father and her brother and her daughter, and never, so far as we can see, broke. But she was more than an instrument, for at the two great moments when she could act, she acted, and acted well. When her brother's throne hung in the balance, she lent her hand to bring her wavering brother back to the cause, and helped, in her quiet way, to restore a king. And when the chance came at last to free herself from a dead marriage and choose her own life, she took it and married the man she loved, and grasped, in the few years left to her, a small portion of happiness that was hers and no one else's. In an age that gave its women almost nothing of their own, those two acts shine out, the loyalty and the choosing. And they are enough to tell us that behind the bare and brutal facts of her recorded life, there was a woman of real spirit and real will, who bent to the great forces of her age because she had to, but who, when she could, stood up and chose. That is no small thing to have been in that hard and bloody time. And it is more than enough to be worth remembering on a quiet night like this one. The eldest daughter of York, who outlasted so much and asked at the end for so little, only to be left in peace with the man she had chosen, and to have two priests sing over her grave forever. There is a larger thought that her life invites before we let her go, about all the women like her whom history has half forgotten. For every king and duke and earl whose deeds fill the chronicles of that age, there stood mothers and wives and sisters and daughters whose lives were every bit as bound up in the momentous events, who suffered the losses and bore the heirs and held the families together and endured the turnings of fortune, and of whom the records preserve only the barest outline: a marriage, a few sons and daughters, a death. The men who wrote the histories cared for battles and councils and the doings of kings, and the women slipped through the gaps in their attention, almost unseen, present at every great moment and yet somehow absent from the page. Anne is one of these. Glimpsed only at the edges of her brother's story, her inner life lost to us entirely, her own voice never once recorded. And yet when we gather up the few hard facts that do survive and hold them to the light, a real woman takes shape behind them, with a will and a loyalty and a longing of her own, who lived through more history than most men ever do, and left her mark, quiet but real, upon her violent age. To recover her, even in outline, even on a dark and drowsy night such as this, is to do a small justice to all the forgotten women who stood beside the famous men and were written out of their own lives. She deserves to be remembered, this eldest daughter of York, and so do they. We do not even know, in the end, what she looked like, and there is something poignant in that final absence. No certain likeness of Anne survives, no portrait taken from the life. For the painting of portraits, as we understand, it was only just beginning to stir in her age, and the faces of all but a very few, of even the greatest, were never set down and have vanished utterly. We can guess a little, for the Yorkist cause was famous for a certain look, the men of it tall and fair and handsome, her brother Edward the very picture of golden kingly beauty, and Anne, his eldest sister, may well have shared in something of that family comeliness. We can picture her in the rich gowns and tall headdresses of her time, can imagine the bearing of a woman bred from birth to the highest rank. But her actual face, the particular features that her family knew, the look in her eyes, the cast of her smile, all of that is gone beyond any recovery. Dissolved into the centuries like the faces of almost all who lived before the age of the painted likeness. She is to us a name and a story, and a scattering of facts, but not a face. And in that she stands for the vast multitude of the human past. The countless millions who lived and loved and suffered and died and left no image of themselves behind. We reach back to her across the centuries and find her there, real and yet faceless, known and yet unseen. The proud daughter of York whose features are lost forever, and whom we must picture, on a night like this, with the eyes of imagination alone. And now the hour has grown late, and it is time to let her go, and to let the grey towers of Fotheringhay, and the snow of Towton, and the candlelit chapel at Windsor fade gently back into the deep hush of the past where they belong. Before we let all of it dissolve, let me say only this. If these slow walks back into vanished centuries are a comfort to you on the nights when sleep is slow to come, then you are always welcome to come back and find another one waiting for you, and to follow along quietly, so that the next of these stories finds its way to you in its turn. There is no hurry about any of it. It is only a thought to carry off toward the morning, and the morning is still a long way away. For now there is nothing left to do, and nothing left to hold. Only the slow and easy drift downward into sleep. Let the names go, the dukes and the monarchs and the quarrelsome lords. The father with his paper crown, and the husband in the cold sea, and the queen who fought so long for her son. Let them all sink softly down into the deep well of the years, where they have rested for so many hundreds of years already, and where they will rest on far beyond this night. And let the proud and patient daughter of York rest there too, in her chapel at Windsor, with her 2 priests singing for her soul in the candlelight, while you let go of the long day and the old story together, and sink down at last into the warm and dreamless dark. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.